Chapter 484. Chief Ifan and other people also decided their sage-level opponents in quick succession, and began to fight. Too arrogant. Yi Shiwen coldly shouted. He didn't say anything further. The iron sword in his hand slashed down along with the sound of collision of metals. It was merely an ordinary iron sword. It wasn't clear from where he had obtained it. However, it displayed the greatest of might in his hand. The sword energy soared into the sky. It swept across violently, and minced the clouds in the sky. The sword streaked across and tore the vast sky. The metal clanging sound sounded unceasingly. This ordinary iron sword carried endless power. In fact, it seemed like some immortal sword. Its power was so destructive that it annihilated everything that came in its path. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen had finally reached the doorway of the devil realm. Bang! The blood-red-clothed young master sneered. The tip of his lance rose up in the air, and broke open a large hole in the void. It looked exceptionally terrifying. Scarlet rays of light covered his entire body. In fact, they started to seem like a blood-red cloak. Rumble! Yi Shiwen's sword and the blood-red-clothed young master's lance collided. The vast sky had been disintegrated. It seemed as if the world had turned upside down. And, the chaos leaked out from the cracks in the space. Both individuals possessed incredible fighting strength. It was a bitter clash, and it seemed as if two massive stars had collided. Their collision was truly earth-shattering. The blood-red-clothed young master became terrified since he realized that his arms had turned a bit numb. He had been suppressed by Yi Shiwen. He had never experienced this before. It wasn't clear how long he had been practicing the cultivation method of the meteor sect. He had been absorbing the power of the stars to temper his body for a very long period of time. He also had the assistance of several other supreme power techniques. But, he rarely revealed them. Therefore, he possessed a genuinely strong body. And, his body had become even stronger after he had begun to practice the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. So, there were a very few people who could rival him when it to physique, let alone suppress him. Both of them are fighting neck to neck. It's an evenly matched battle. They have met a good opponent, someone among the spectators who were standing afar spoke up. They still had more confidence on the blood-red-clothed young master in comparison to Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen was certainly very powerful. However, the experts whom he had killed were at the semi-sage realm. None of them were as powerful as a sage expert. However, the blood-red-clothed young master had ripped apart a senior sage-level ancestor of the Great Yu State before their eyes. However, they didn't expect that it would be an evenly matched fight in reality. Whoosh! The two figures broke away from each other. And, each landed on top of a mountain peak. They were standing opposite to each other, and were separated by a long distance. Incredible energies were fluctuating on their bodies. Very good. Very good. You're quite strong. However, it's also a good thing. I would advance a step further and proclaim myself as Hegemon after I've absorbed your essence and blood. The blood-red-clothed young master didn't get scared after being amazed at first. On the contrary, he became more insolent. Yi Shiwen's eyes had turned ice-cold. An incredible chill was surging in his eyes. The blood-red-clothed young master had annoyed him. You're dishonest. And, your ways are truly despicable. Humph. Dishonest? What do you know? I'm the most powerful and talented person. I'm the most eligible person to inherit the throne. I don't care about the methods as long as I can achieve my goal. I don't care if I have to slaughter people, as long as I can practice the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. A cruel smile appeared on the face of the blood-red-clothed young master. This bloodbath was no different than walking on a pile of ants for him. You are talking nonsense. You are just a coward, and nothing more. You have already lost the self-confidence in your own strength and discipline. Yi Shiwen shook his head and replied in a pitiful manner. You're courting death. It seemed as if Yishuan's words had touched a sore spot of the blood-red-clothed young master's heart. Consequently, a ruthless, killing intention began to boil in his eyes. Bang! The lance point dropped on top of the mountain peak, and it got disintegrated. The surrounding atmosphere began to boil vigorously, and gradually began to transform into a red color. Then, the strands of these red-colored energies swept across. And, the space was crushed into fragments wherever they went. Yishuan's long sword streaked across the sky. He and his sword looked very ordinary in comparison to the dreadful might of the blood-red-clothed young master. However, it seemed as if his one sword would break 10,000 principles as it swept out. And, it appeared as if any terrifying attack would get defeated by his ordinary iron sword. Clang! A loud metal clanging sound reverberated. The tip of the sword and the point of the lance collided. Both individuals looked like two formidable gods who had decided to fight on the earth. Both of them retreated several steps by the terrifying force of their collision. The space had been crushed as they trod several steps onto it. And, the rumbling sound echoed in the surroundings. Their murderous auras overflowed the sky. The power in their attacks had decreased a bit. However, their movements were still incredibly quick. And, they had already exchanged hundreds of moves within a short time. In fact, their movements were as quick as the lightning that pierces the atmosphere. The complementary shock waves produced by their clashes bulldozed countless mountains down. The fight between these two individuals had been tantamount to an enormous disaster for the surrounding space. In fact, the entire space in this region might collapse if any one of them wasn't careful. Everyone became scared. The experts of the younger generation especially found themselves too ordinary as they witnessed this level of fight and tried to compare themselves to these two individuals. Such fighting strength was enough to be named as the peak expert of the initial stage of the Sage realm. So, they looked too ordinary in front of these two individuals. Clang! Both sides had exchanged more than 100 moves within a short time period. Yishuan's moves weren't too splendid. He would only hack and slash his sword in a casual manner. However, the blood-red-clothed young master would have to defend himself from these sword attacks every single time. In fact, the blood-red-clothed young master couldn't launch any large-scale attack on him because of this. The blood-red-clothed young master became terrified as he realized that he had been suppressed by Yishuan. His arms had turned numb. Moreover, he wasn't in the kind of situation where he could use his real elemental energy to overcome this numbness either. Clang! The loud sound of metallic vibrations came from the sky. And, the energy rushed upwards into the clouds. Yishuan didn't give the blood-red-clothed young master a chance to respite, and the fierce sword once again swept down towards him. Yishuan had taken the path of full-on large-scale attacks. In layman's language, he had gone all out to kill his target by using brute force. In fact, he hadn't even used any fancy moves in the process. The long sword in Yishuan's hand didn't seem to issue any complicated sword moves. It only displayed basic sword moves. However, Yishuan possessed the greatest might in his hand. And, it seemed as if it would bring about Armageddon as it slashed down towards the blood-red-clothed young master. Whoosh! The blood-red-clothed young master had no choice but to move forward to face the attack. He mustn't show any weakness this time. Bang! 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 Both sides went all out. They didn't use any gaudy and gorgeous moves. It was a blatant collision of brute force. Anyway, no fancy styles would have worked in the face of such raw power. The blood-red-clothed young master spared no effort while he confronted Yishuan. However, he had still been suppressed by Yishuan. Moreover, he didn't get any time to breathe while facing Yishuan's quick and fierce sword attacks. Each of these moves was very simple and basic. However, he had to face them nonetheless. Yishuan wouldn't die if he were to receive one of his blows. However, he would certainly be hacked if he were to receive even a single blow of Yishuan's. He had also figured out that Yishuan possessed a formidable physique since they had exchanged so many moves. He didn't know what kind of special physique Yishuan possessed. However, he couldn't dare to face Yishuan's iron sword head-on. Many spectators were left dumbstruck as they watched this from afar. This fight had started only moments ago. But, the fight had diverted from their imaginations since the blood-red-clothed young master hadn't gained the upper hand even once. Rather, Yishuan had. Moreover, Yishuan was still gradually suppressing him into a worse situation. What kind of physique does Yishuan possess? How he can be so ferocious? I can tell that blood-red-clothed young master isn't daring to receive even one attack from him. Yishuan's iron sword had merely touched his lance, and then I saw that his hands were left to tremble. That is known as tyrant body. It is said to be an extremely ferocious physique. Even the Titan body isn't its match. Someone explained it. That fight which had taken place in the true martial university had gradually become publicly known. So, Yishuan had gradually become famous in the world. Yishuan's complexion didn't change. However, he had become a bit anxious inside. And, that was because this blood-red-clothed young master was very cunning. In fact, he wasn't as wild and tyrannical as he would pretend to be. He had switched to guerrilla tactics after he had realized that he would lose if he were to recklessly charge head-on. Consequently, he would attack, and then promptly pull back. He didn't prolong the time frame of the contact. His movements were also extremely quick. Yishuan hadn't opened his demon wings yet. Therefore, he wasn't at his top speed at this time. So, he couldn't overtake the opponent. Otherwise, a single sword strike would have chopped his opponent into two halves. Ha! Yishuan shouted loudly. He then suddenly attacked, and the iron sword transformed into a dragon. It crushed the void, and the entire world trembled under its might. The tyrannical sword energy broke down everything in the surroundings. This was the so-called, I have the entire world in my hand if I have a long sword in my hand. Yishuan wasn't a sword cultivator. However, there wasn't any difference between him and a sword cultivator when the long sword was in his hand. Rumble. The long sword pressed down and crushed everything. It seemed as if the world had collapsed. The might of this sword was enormous. However, its speed was also extremely quick. Yishuan had slashed down this long sword with all his strength. The essence of the buried heaven sword had been revealed to its peak. It was only an ordinary iron sword which had been slashed down in a casual manner. However, he had already mastered the sword intention. So, it seemed as if it would destroy the world once it was brandished. Puchi. The speed of this sword was so fast that the blood-red-clothed young master didn't get any time to react. And, it cut open a terrible wound in his body. Blood splashed out and sprayed in the air. Yishuan's movement was extremely quick. In fact, it was almost like the lightning. The majority of people couldn't see the movements of these two individuals very clearly. And, they only saw the blood as it splashed out. Consequently, they didn't know who had sustained the injuries. The eyes of many people remained wide open as they saw this scene. They had almost been scared to death. Almost everyone had been more optimistic about the blood-red-clothed young master before the fight had begun. However, Yishuan had gained the upper hand here. Therefore, he had established himself as more formidable and savage than the blood-red-clothed young master in such a short time. Many people had blind trust on the blood-red-clothed young master. So, they were still thinking that he would win until a moment ago. However, they became extremely amazed when they found out that Yishuan wasn't the first one to sustain injuries in the battle. Rather, the blood-red-clothed young master was. The blood-red-clothed young master has been injured. How's this possible? Many people had become shocked as they saw this scene. A chill ran down their spines. And, a feeling of reverence and awe aroused inside them as they saw Yishuan's slim figure. You have completely infuriated me. The blood-red-clothed young master couldn't believe his eyes as he saw the wounds on his own body. And, he shouted in a ferocious manner. Chapter 485. Scarlet flames were frantically burning on the body of the blood-red-clothed young master. and spooky screams could be heard from the flames. "You talk nonsense," an astonishing sword beam emerged along with Yi Shiwen's shout. Yi Shiwen's movement was extremely quick. And he forged ahead to kill without any hesitation. He didn't even think about whether the blood-red-clothed young master had finished speaking or not. The blood-red-clothed young master roared. His lance went into the sky, and produced an inexhaustible lance shadow. It punctured the sky, and pressed down the horizon. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it swept down. Rumble. The lance's shadow and the sword's beam collided in the void. Consequently, a dreadful force began to boil, and then swept all across. The blood-red-clothed young master retreated several steps in order to escape Yi Shiwen's terrifying power. He had put his own body at stake, and had gone all out. However, he wasn't Yi Shiwen's opponent. He couldn't suppress Yi Shiwen even after he had used his power or his secret techniques. On the contrary, he had been forced to retreat by Yi Shiwen's incessant attacks. Yi Shiwen collected his iron sword, and assumed a stance. A boundless and grand aura spread out, and submerged the surroundings. It seemed as if the surroundings had transformed into a universe within a split second. He and the blood-red-clothed young master were in the center of this universe at this time. It seemed as if he had broken this world and had established another one in its place. He had mastered the elements earth, fire, water, and wind. A huge formation of stars had appeared behind him. It gradually began to rotate, and started to emit a domineering aura. Both of them had landed into a sea of stars. It should be mentioned that the blood-red-clothed young master had fallen into the ideal condition of Yi Shiwen's fist technique. "What kind of martial arts technique is this? It looks incredible," someone spoke up while trembling with fear. The ideal condition of a martial arts technique and its level were usually related to each other. The higher the level of a martial arts technique, more dreadful its ideal condition would be. Moreover, that entire universe had been integrated into this fist technique in this case. So, one could well imagine the level of this martial arts technique. The complexion of the blood-red-clothed young master had also turned exceptionally ugly. He had been dragged inside the secret world of Yi Shiwen's martial arts technique. So, the consequences would certainly be very serious. Rumble. Yi Shiwen shot his fist, and that huge formation of stars began to move behind him. It swept forth, and issued terrifying rumbling sound. It rushed in from all directions, and swept over towards the blood-red-clothed young master to crush him. Whoosh! The blood-red-clothed young master displayed the mystical world of his own martial arts technique in order to counter Yi Shiwen's secret world. A scarlet world suddenly appeared, and bloody waves started to surge everywhere. Then, a blood emperor took his place above those bloody waves. He shot his scarlet lance upward to welcome the incoming attack. It suddenly thrust out. The scarlet lance produced scarlet ripples as it swept out. And, everything turned red wherever the ripples went. The blood-red-clothed young master was cruel and extremely arrogant. However, he genuinely did possess extremely powerful strength. His magical power overflowed the sky, and it was truly dreadful. In fact, it was more than sufficient to meet the standard of a top heavens pride-level expert. A breaking sound was suddenly heard since the sea of stars was ripped apart. After that, mighty and boundless sonic booms dissipated in all directions. And, the Blood Emperor rode upon the scarlet waves, and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen's big star formation. Rumble. The Blood Emperor and the stars collided. This was a contest between two individuals who possessed terrifying willpowers. Bang! The Blood Emperor was crushed into fragments by that huge star formation. He managed to recondense some distance away, but he had seemingly dimmed by a significant margin. The complexion of the blood-red-clothed young master turned as gloomy and cold as dusk when he looked at Yi Shiwen. He then brandished his lance along with a long and loud roar. It emitted scarlet rays of light and suppressed the surroundings as it pressed down like a giant dragon. The iron sword appeared in Yi Shiwen's hand once again. After that, his right hand unleashed the buried sword secret, while his left showcased the Big Bang Stardust Fist. He was doing two tasks at one time. His hands were unleashing the two different fighting techniques at the same time. Only he could do such a thing. He had become habitual of doing two tasks at a time ever since he had obtained the mysterious space. Even his mind had become used to multitasking. Two stunning secret techniques pressed down at the same time. And, the blood-red-clothed young master retreated in the face of such attacks. The huge star formation swept down to crush, and the iron sword went forth to slash. Yi Xuan had gone all out. He wasn't holding back one bit. The fight between these two individuals had become incomparably dreadful. It wasn't clear how many times that Scarlet World and Yi Xuan's star field had clashed in one moment. The Scarlet Ocean had reversed its direction due to the clashes, while the stars had started to chip off. Both the individuals had resorted to extreme methods. The blood-red-clothed young master firmly clenched his teeth, and made his best effort to attack again. And, the scarlet lance swept out like a dragon. Bang! Yi Xuan's sword slashed down. It appeared as heavy as a star. The blood-red-clothed young master raised his lance to resist the attack. However, his palm was split open in a split second. It had been ruptured by the vigorous power that had been instilled into Yi Xuan's sword move. The blood-red-clothed young master had survived till now. And, this feat was already beyond Yi Xuan's imagination. One must know that an average person couldn't resist a single sword move of Yi Xuan's. However, this man had managed to survive till now. And, this feat was enough to prove that he also possessed an extraordinary physique. Moreover, each of the Heaven's Pride-level experts was good in some aspects, and also had some weaknesses. However, he didn't have any clear weak points. His physique was beyond an ordinary person's imagination, even if it wasn't as incredible as that of Emperor Chen's. However, Yi Xuan had displayed the superiority of his physique when they had clashed. Puchi. The blood-red-clothed young master spouted a mouthful of blood. He vomited blood from his mouth. His body looked very insignificant in front of the stars. It was impossible for him to face the continued barrage of Yi Xuan's stars and the buried sword's secret attack at the same time. His eyes had finally started to reveal a look of panic at this time, since he hadn't thought that things would turn out like this. His ego and arrogance had originated from his strength. He could be considered at the peak in the younger generation. Therefore, he hadn't expected that he would suffer loss in such a rural region of the true martial world. Moreover, this situation could be considered as a big loss for him. However, he still hadn't lost the confidence. Everything would reverse once that black-robed old man would defeat that skinny and old man in servant attire. And then, this guy before his eyes would die. He had confidence on that black-robed old man's abilities. After all, he was his protector. He was considered as an extremely powerful expert. Moreover, he was at the peak of the Sage Realm. A stunning battle had broken out in the sky. And, all kinds of creative concepts were being displayed there. The fight had reached to an intense degree. In fact, it was much fiercer than the fight between Yi Xuan and the blood-red-clothed young master. Puchi. The complexion of the old man in servant's attire had turned ice cold. His blade had swept down, and an arm of that black-robed old man had been chopped down as a result. In fact, his arm had been cut down by the blade intention of that skinny old man. It was a stunning attack. And, it seemed to be a very ancient move. Ah! The black-robed old man screamed endlessly. His entire left arm had been severed. Consequently, blood splashed out, and formed a scarlet pool on the ground. His eyes were filled with a look of horror. He couldn't believe that his arm had been severed by a blade move. However, the skinny old man didn't wish to give him any chance to breathe. And, another blade attack was hacked down immediately after. Bang! The blade intention congealed together, and came slashing down, as if on its own will. It seemed unstoppable. Puchi. The blade energy swept down, and issued incredible rays of light. The black-robed old man didn't get any time to respond, and his entire body got cut into two halves. Blood splashed out as his body got hacked into two halves. Everyone was left dumbstruck by this development. They hadn't anticipated that they would see such a scene. The real fight hadn't even started long ago. And the fight didn't continue for several days and nights as they had thought. In fact, the winner and the loser had been decided in such a short time. On the contrary, a peak expert of the sage realm had fallen before their eyes. How is this possible? The blood-red-clothed young master couldn't believe his eyes. A part of his concentration had remained fixed on the body of the black-robed old man from the beginning. After all, he knew that the final result was dependent on the outcome of the fight between these two senior peak-level sage experts. However, he hadn't anticipated that the outcome would be decided so soon. And he had obviously never imagined that the person on his own side would lose. The situation had changed very dramatically all of a sudden. Yishuan raised his iron sword. He pointed towards the blue dome of the heaven, and said, "Now, I will send you on your way to hell." The complexion of the blood-red-clothed young master had turned ugly. He had fallen into the disadvantageous position in this battle with Yishuan. And that black-robed old man had been his only hope. However, he had been killed as well. Consequently, he had lost all hope. Bang! His energy soared into the sky. His aura had promptly moved to the peak since he knew that he didn't have any time to think. "I will kill you in one move." There was no expression on Yishuan's face. His opponent's fate had been sealed. However, the fight between him and the blood-red-clothed young master hadn't ended yet. But he didn't wish to delay any further. Qi Fifan, Yang Wenjun, and other people had also obtained overwhelming advantages in their respective battles. Their opponents had previously held the positions of the senior experts of various forces of the Southeast region's 10 countries. However, they had surrendered because of the tyranny of that black-robed old man whom the blood-red-clothed young master had brought here. However, that black-robed old man had been killed. So, why would these people willingly stake their lives and press forward for no reason? However, they couldn't escape because of the interceptions that were made by Qi Fifan and the others. It had taken some time, but the disparity between the fairly matured sage experts like Qi Fifan and his teammates and those old ancestors had eventually been revealed. These ancestors had already become old. Why would they have willingly laid down their ambitions and stayed here in Southeast region if they hadn't become very old? They had nearly no hopes for breakthroughs. However, Qi Fifan and his teammates were different. They would fight with honesty and vigor. And they would display explosive strength while fighting. Consequently, they had suppressed those old fogies with the passage of time. Yishuan didn't wish to delay any further. And the blood-red-clothed young master also knew that he might get a chance to escape, but only if he could kill Yishuan right now. Otherwise, he might get killed on the spot. Clang! Yishuan brandished his long sword. It transformed into a huge star, and it fell down from the sky like a bolt of lightning. It looked grand and dreadful. The entire void had been cut into two halves by the descending sword energy. The blood-red-clothed young master also used his entire strength. His lance shot out, and punctured the sky. He clearly knew what this one attack could mean for him. Bang! The dreadful sound of the collision of the weapons swept out. And it set off waves of storms. Puchi! The hands of the blood-red-clothed young master had been fractured by this collision. He spouted blood from his mouth. In fact, the bones in his entire body had been smashed by this attack. Puchi! The blood-red-clothed young master's defense was shattered by Yishuan. Then, his entire body got cut into two halves, and transformed into a mass of blood fog. Chapter 486. Yishuan had just relaxed a moment ago. However, he suddenly saw that the blood-red-clothed young master had slowly begun to condense in the air again. And he slowly regained his shape soon after. Yishuan, you can't kill me. I'm immortal. The Blood Emperor is immortal. Ha 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 ha. The blood-red-clothed young master burst into laughter as he spoke this. His countenance had turned a bit sinister. Yi Shiwen's complexion had turned solemn. He knew that the blood-red-clothed young master might have practiced some dishonest method of the demon gods. And so, he may have become an existence that was neither a ghost, nor a demon. What? He had been cut into two halves a moment ago. But, he still hasn't died. The blood-red-clothed young master isn't a human. The experts gasped from afar. It seemed as if they couldn't believe the scene which had played before their eyes. He didn't die. Can someone really kill him? This is unnatural. Yi Shiwen, this fight has just begun, the blood-red-clothed young master shouted. The lance in his hand was pointing towards Yi Shiwen from afar. The point of the lance issued astonishing scarlet lights. After that, a scarlet battle armor crawled over his entire body. His body had been cut into two halves a moment ago. However, it had restored at an astonishing speed. Moreover, intermittent screams had sounded as this scene had unfolded. These were the screams of the resentful ghosts of the people he had killed. Countless people got terrified as they saw this strange scene. It seemed as if his body was undergoing some unfathomable transformation. His present aura had suddenly made a qualitative leap in comparison to his previous one. His aura had only made everyone feel gloomy and cold in the past. However, his present negative demonic energy had left them terrified. In fact, they had been scared to death even if they were watching him from afar. Yi Shiwen coldly looked at his transformation. He could feel that something had burst open in his opponent's body. Consequently, his body had gone in an unknown direction because of this astonishing speed of its transformation. However, Yi Shiwen knew that he mustn't allow him to proceed with the transformation. Rumble. Yi Shiwen didn't delay, and he launched the Big Bang Stardust Fist attack. The surroundings transformed into the void of universe. And, countless stars began to revolve inside it in a crazed manner. Nobody dared to come close this time. They knew that these stars weren't real, and were merely an illusion. However, they were more terrifying than the real stars because these ones had been formed by Yi Shiwen's fist intention. So, they would die if they came in contact with them. Yi Shiwen's fist had transformed into a huge star. It wasn't clear how big it was in reality. It suddenly swept down towards the blood-red-clothed young master to crush him. The blood-red-clothed young master also roared like a madman. His figure had gradually begun to fuse into the Blood Emperor who stood behind him. The Blood Emperor had begun to transform as a result. In fact, it had soon come to possess a presence of its own. His eyes looked like a pair of huge lanterns, and they were brimming with killing intention for Yi Shiwen. I wasn't ready to use this card since I wanted to use it against that bastard. So, congratulations, Yi Shiwen. You're the first one who has seen this secret power of mine. And, I grant you death now, the blood-red-clothed young master spoke up coldly in an anger-filled voice. The blood-red-clothed young master looked a bit relieved inside that Blood Emperor. He had finally transformed into a monster which was neither a human, nor a demon. So, Yi Shiwen was already a dead man in his opinion. Consequently, he gradually sank into his own thoughts. This thought had remained buried deep inside his memories for a long time. He used to be an individual of the Meteor sect who wanted to obtain his father's recognition for becoming the young lord. He was a young genius. So, he had inevitably enjoyed all the praises, until that year when his elder brother had appeared. His figure was like a giant mountain. And, it had become a nightmare that had destroyed his life. Everyone was surprised by his elder brother. Consequently, those praises and approvals were taken away. Even his fame as a genius had also been snatched away by his elder brother. Moreover, he cared about his father's recognition the most, but that was also snatched away. He had been waiting for an opportunity since the day he had obtained the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. He didn't even know how many people he had killed in order to practice the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. He had invested everything, and all he wanted in return was to kill those people who had despised him once. He wanted to break the neck of that bastard with his own hands since his old man's facial expression would become quite splendid when that would happen. The movements of the blood-red-clothed young master's hand didn't slow down. In fact, his movements had become even quicker after he had fused with that blood emperor. Then, the scarlet lance thrust out as endless scarlet energies wrapped around it. Both individuals had resorted to extreme methods. And, this was enough to crush the entire world. Rumble. The battle wreaked havoc in the surroundings. And, the cracks became visible in the sky. In fact, the cracks proliferated across the sky like massive spider webs. They could be considered as formidable opponents for each other. However, Yishuan was clearly a bit steadier, while the blood-red-clothed young master was more of the impatient type. In fact, he had become even more anxious after the death of that black-robed old man. He was born to sail with the wind as the young lord of the meteor sect. When had he ever been forced into such a disadvantageous situation in a battle? However, his opponent was an evil genius like Yishuan. He had met the strongest opponent in the form of Yishuan. But, he wasn't the strongest opponent for Yishuan. However, this was the first time that Yishuan had met an evenly matched opponent after his fighting strength had reached the sage realm. The blood-red-clothed young master's strength had increased by leaps and bounds after he had fused with that great blood emperor. He had been nothing for Yishuan in the beginning. In fact, he would have already been killed by Yishuan if he hadn't used his schemes and the guerrilla tactics. After all, the gilded tyrant form was extremely powerful. Nobody had met a good end while facing Yishuan's tyrant form. The same thing had happened with the one with the titan body. One could say that Yishuan had never encountered physiques that were more powerful than the titan's body, the barbarian god's real body, and so on. And perhaps, those physiques could have been able to contend against the tyrant body. Yishuan had also thought that whether he would be able to sweep away a truly powerful person if ever faced one. After all, the one with titan body only possessed the bloodline of titans, and nothing more. So, it would be an entirely different scenario if he were to come across a real titan. In that case, Yishuan would probably have to fight a bloody battle instead of a bitter struggle. This blood emperor was enough to make him pay attention towards himself. Rumble. It took long to describe, but everything had happened in a split second. Both sides had once again begun to attack each other without any hesitation. Both of them had resorted to extreme methods, and had refused to give up. It was a dreadful fight. Everyone's hearts had begun to bounce ferociously. These two individuals were extremely ferocious. Almost everyone's gaze was fixed on these two individuals after the fight between that black-robed man and the skinny old man had ended. The fights between other sage experts like Qi Fifan and those old experts had already come to an end. Those old experts had been utterly defeated and killed. After all, these sage experts had become very old. Therefore, there was a big disparity between them and the likes of Qi Fifan who had become mature, and possessed plenty of vitality. However, the blood-red-clothed young master had soon become terrified since he had realized that he still couldn't overpower Yishuan. He saw Yishuan standing firmly in midair. He didn't know when those golden divinities had crawled over that slim body of Yishuan's. Yishuan looked like an ancient golden god of war who was clad in a divine cloak, and was looking disdainfully at the mortals from the void. He had become even stronger. He had also unleashed his gilded tyrant form to the peak. Therefore, he had become far stronger than before. Rumble. The scarlet and golden figures looked like two clouds in the sky. They blotted out the sky and covered the earth as they swept out towards each other. Bang! Everyone heard a loud and dull scream. It had originated from that terrifying energy storm. After that, a figure dashed out of it. Everyone was startled. They stretched their necks to see who had won. They knew that both individuals had disclosed their hidden cards. Thus, the person who would sustain injuries first would lose for certain. Everyone looked closely. That person turned out to be the blood-red-clothed young master. They were surprised to see that his chest had nearly been punctured. He was drenched with blood, and the blood was still gushing out unceasingly. The scarlet face of that blood-red-clothed young master had suddenly turned pale. That blow had left him seriously injured. In fact, that blow would have killed him if he hadn't transformed into the Immortal Blood Emperor, a monstrous physique which was neither a human, nor a demon. That blow had inflicted serious injuries to him. And, it had also shaken his invincible confidence. After all, he hadn't disclosed his hidden trump. So, he hadn't lost his confidence even when Yishuan had cut him into two halves. However, the situation had changed now. He had displayed his strongest fighting strength. However, he had still sustained serious injuries at Yishuan's hands. Moreover, he hadn't been able to inflict any injury to Yishuan. Was he genuinely so powerful? This was the most unacceptable thing for him. He believed that he would be able to run amok the younger generation since he had practiced the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. He felt that it would be enough for him to break that bastard's neck in front of that old man. However, he couldn't even defeat Yishuan, a man he hadn't even heard about. And, this shock had made him numb. Why? Why has this happened? I'm invincible, the blood-red-clothed young master muttered in disbelief. Many experts became excited when they saw this scene from afar, especially those who hated the blood-red-clothed young master. They hadn't been able to voice their objections in the past because of this man's dominance. But, they could finally hope for the dawn of a new era now. Yishuan's formidable strength wasn't a good thing for them either. However, he wasn't like that blood-red-clothed young master, and he wouldn't kill everyone after he had captured a city. Yishuan stepped forward, and rushed forth. The divine golden cloak made him look aloof and indifferent. His invincible aura was similar to that of a mythical being. The strength could be improved. However, not everyone could possess such an incredible aura. He had gradually accumulated such an imposing aura and self-confidence after having defeated countless opponents. The blood-red-clothed young master's aura was initially similar to that of Yishuan's. However, his had disappeared after this blow. Meanwhile, Yishuan's had become even stronger. Yishuan didn't give him any opportunity to respite, and rushed towards him. It was hard to fully heal his chest since Yishuan's energy was coming in the way of the healing process. Consequently, his chest had been left to bleed. The blood-red-clothed young master shouted loudly. He wanted to counterattack. However, he had no strength left in him. His entire strength had been drained by now. Yishuan arrived in front of him, and raised him by the neck. Yishuan, don't you dare kill me. My meteor sect's life sign token will break if I die. Then, everyone in the meteor sect will come to know that you have committed an offense, and you won't be able to escape. The blood-red-clothed young master looked fiercely at Yishuan. He then burst into laughter as he said this. Don't dare to kill me. Bang! Yishuan crushed that blood-red-clothed young master's body, and it exploded. Chapter 487. The blood-red-clothed young master was assured that Yishuan wouldn't dare to kill him. After all, the meteor sect had a formidable reputation. In fact, it was of the same level as the true martial university used to be in the past. The true martial university was still quite powerful. Experts were present in abundance, just like clouds. However, it couldn't be compared with the true martial university of those glorious days. There was basically no comparison in that respect. In fact, the true martial university of the past was more powerful than the combined strength of the forces of the current true martial world. Therefore, one could imagine what kind of a force the meteor sect was. The people of the true martial university obviously wouldn't have cared about a young lord of the meteor sect if the true martial university were to be at the same level as before. However, the situation was different now. Therefore, the blood-red-clothed young master was confident that Yishuan wouldn't dare to kill him. This was also his last resort. After all, he didn't have the option to escape after the death of that black-robed old man. Don't dare to kill me. Bang! Yishuan crushed the body of the blood-red-clothed young master, and it exploded. He then pulled out his soul from his body, and tossed it inside the heavenly source mirror. Yishuan thought that it was the right thing to do. Yishuan was wary of the meteor sect. After all, it wasn't inferior to a powerful force like the true martial university of the old times. However, it didn't mean that he would let this man off. He couldn't kill this man. So, he pulled out his soul, and put it into the heavenly source mirror. And, he intended to keep it there until the time when the meteor sect wouldn't be able to cause any trouble for him. Bang! A magical tool had swept out from the body of the blood-red-clothed young master at the time his body had transformed into blood fog. It was a sage tool. Therefore, it hadn't broken when Yishuan had crushed his body. This divine tool looked like a plate-shaped seal. It was blood-red in color. And, only one word was engraved on it, Emperor. Yishuan searched the soul of the blood-red-clothed young master, and found out about a myriad of evil secrets. This divine tool was known as Blood Emperor Seal. He had refined it from the many precious materials he had collected. It could be said that this Blood Emperor Seal was the biggest wealth that he possessed. This secret divine tool and his Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique suited each other very well. However, he hadn't gotten enough time to unleash it. Otherwise, it would have displayed enormous power. Yishuan naturally came to know about the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique after he had searched this young master's soul. However, he wasn't interested in it. It wasn't that the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique wasn't powerful. On the contrary, it was a very powerful technique. It might even be a power technique of some big force of the medieval era. Moreover, the blood-red-clothed young master hadn't even obtained it in its complete version. However, Yishuan possessed the observing person scripture. So, the other power techniques were like fleeting clouds for him. Moreover, the soul memories of the blood-red-clothed young master also told him that one must transform their body into the immortal body of Blood Emperor in order to practice this power technique to the peak. One might even get transformed into a person who'd be neither a ghost nor a demon. And, Yishuan didn't want that. However, he could learn a few things from it. For example, Yishuan was quite envious of the ability which had enabled that blood-red-clothed young master to reorganize his body after he had been cut into two halves. His Phoenix regeneration technique was also quite incredible. And, his gilded tyrant form was even more incredible. However, the consequences could be too disastrous if he were to be cut into two halves. Yishuan tossed the Blood Emperor seal into the heavenly source mirror. However, something unexpected happened, and he was totally surprised by it. He had barely put that Blood Emperor seal into the heavenly source mirror, when a big hand suddenly stretched out and grabbed it. Yishuan was about to react when he heard Yimo's feeble voice, "Yishuan, don't attack. It's me. Yimo." Yishuan promptly exposed a surprised look. He hadn't expected that he would sense Yimo's presence this time. Yishuan hadn't felt Yimo's presence since the time Yimo had landed into deep sleep. In fact, it was like Yimo had already disappeared for him. Moreover, he didn't have any method to sense Yimo since he wasn't responding. Therefore, he hadn't anticipated that he would finally sense Yimo at this time. "Yimo, how are you?" Yishuan promptly spoke inside his consciousness. "I'm fine. But, I am too exhausted. I'm taking this divine tool. I must consume as many of these divine tools in order to recover." Yimo's voice still sounded weak as he said. Yimo hadn't attacked at that time. He had merely released his imposing aura to intimidate the enemy. However, he had exhausted most of his energy in doing that. In fact, nearly the entirety of his energy had depleted. It could be reckoned that he would have died if he were to be a human being. However, he was a tool spirit. So, he had only fallen into deep sleep. Yishuan knew that Yimo could be a match for sage experts as long as he had stimulated the heavenly source mirror to its full potential, and had enough spirit stones for backup. However, he had fallen into deep sleep that day since he had revealed his imposing aura. Initially, he had seemed to be a match for that person. However, he hadn't responded for several years after that. That man was unimaginably dreadful. You will have to find many divine tools in the future. Only then can I recover quickly. Emo disappeared again. He said this. And, it soon seemed as if he hadn't ever appeared. Yishuan became sluggish for a moment. This was a sage tool, and not some cabbage that anyone could own one. Most sage experts were still using pseudo-sage tools, and they too weren't easy to get a hold of. Several senior sage experts had arrived in the 10 countries of Southeast region at this time. However, they too were using pseudo-sage tools. Only the blood-red-clothed young master possessed a sage tool. However, Yishuan grumbled at this thought. He would have some hope to find sage tools if he knew the way, even if it were to be difficult. Therefore, he was mostly troubled by the fact that he didn't have a direction to tread on. Consequently, he didn't know the direction in which he should put his efforts in. Sage tools were rare. However, he believed that it would become easier for him to get hold of sage tools along with the unceasing promotion of his cultivation. A long time had passed in Yishuan's heart. However, it seemed as if an instant had passed in the outside world. Everyone was still immersed in the shock that Yishuan had killed the blood-red-clothed young master. Yishuan had certainly gained the upper hand from the beginning of the fight. However, gaining upper hand didn't mean that he could kill the opponent on his own. After all, the blood-red-clothed young master had long been famous. Therefore, those spectators were left in shock when they saw him getting killed. I didn't expect that the blood-red-clothed young master will die at Yishuan's hands. Moreover, there wasn't any suspense in the fight, and he was defeated in such a direct manner. Yishuan is extremely ferocious. Someone still couldn't believe that a sage expert had died before their eyes. A sage expert was like a god in the 10 countries of the Southeast region. Therefore, killing a sage expert was akin to killing a god. And, such an incident was bound to leave them stunned. The fate had been decided, and the dust had settled. The Great Qi State's 2 biggest benefactors had died in the battle. What could the remaining people possibly do now? There were many supporters of Qi State among those spectators. Many of them were also the experts of the Qi State. So, their complexion turned deathly pale when they saw this scene. In fact, it seemed as if they were mourning the loss of their mothers. Bang! Suddenly, boundless blood and energy broke out like tsunami waves from the place where the blood-red-clothed young master's body had exploded. The resentment and roars of countless people were mixed in that boundless blood and energy as it swept across. The scarlet flood swept out at an extremely fast speed. It had spread out in a flash. Yishuan, Qi Fifan, and his teammates reacted very quickly. And, they flew high up in the air almost immediately. However, some spectators weren't so lucky. Many among those were merely Truth Realm experts. And, they turned into skeletons as they got flooded by this bloody flood. The loud screams began to reverberate unceasingly. Yishuan had clearly seen that they hadn't been flooded and reduced into skeletons. Rather, they had been eaten alive, and thus turned into skeletons. The number of resentful souls contained in that endless bloody flood wasn't clear. These resentful souls belonged to those innocent people who the blood-red-clothed young master had killed. Yishuan didn't know that whether there were things like hell, reincarnation, and so on in this world or not. However, he knew that a resentment force would be generated if a person met a tragic death. And, that force would linger around in the form of a resentful soul. This was general knowledge. The more tragic the death of a person, the more intense their resentful soul would be. And, the people who had been killed by the blood-red-clothed young master were truly innocent. So, one could imagine how much hatred and resentment they must have possessed. Moreover, this was the resentful force which had been formed by the souls of many such innocent people. Even the sage experts would have to step away if they saw this. This was the reason an average person didn't dare to approach some large battlefields. They knew that there would be too many resentful souls in the vicinity. One wouldn't be worried if there were only 1 or 2 resentful souls. However, who wouldn't be scared if hundreds of thousands of such souls, or perhaps millions of such souls rushed over towards them? Perhaps 10 million of such souls were present in this bloody flood. Those Truth Realm experts had only begun to touch upon the world principles. How they could have possibly resisted this force. The memory of the blood-red-clothed young master also informed Yishuan that he would require a huge volume of people's essence and blood in order to practice the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. Therefore, that man would frequently slaughter everyone in a city he had captured. He would attack and kill everyone in a city he had captured without any reason, since he wanted to obtain a huge volume of essence and blood to provide assistance to his cultivation of Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. The malicious nature of this power technique was evident from his fact. This was also one of the main reasons why Yishuan didn't choose to practice the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. This power technique looked quite good. The cultivation speed was also very quick. However, one must slaughter tens of millions of people if they wanted to practice this power technique till the sage realm alone. And, they must kill even more people if they wanted to practice it further. It wasn't impossible. However, one would need to keep killing people until it was mastered. Not everyone who practiced evil technique resorted to indiscriminate killings. However, that wouldn't make one a powerful cultivator. Moreover, one would attract the attentions of countless people after they had slaughtered so many people. Most experts didn't pay attention to the ordinary people. However, these ordinary people were the very foundations of the big forces. The majority of disciples in a force came from ordinary background. So, a force wouldn't be very far from extinction if there were no ordinary people. Therefore, he might get chased down if he practiced the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. And, Yishuan didn't want such a thing to happen. He was determined to kill only while facing an enemy, and not indiscriminately. Moreover, who would control such destructive and overflowing flood after his death? It would create a huge mess. Moreover, he must be prepared to bear the entirety of these resentment forces if he wanted to practice the Dark Spirit Blood Power technique. One would get overpowered by these resentment force, and lose to one's inner demons if one were to be careless. And then, they would go crazy. The blood-red-clothed young master had suppressed these essence and blood within his body with the help of Blood Emperor Seal. But, Yishuan had taken away the Blood Emperor Seal after his death. So, all of it had suddenly broken out since the repression force had been removed. However, Yimo had already taken away the Blood Emperor Seal from him by now. Therefore, Yishuan had no choice but to clench his teeth as he saw the blood and energy rampaging as far as the eyes could see. He could only do that much. Chapter 488. These essence and blood had initially been suppressed by the Blood Emperor Seal. However, that suppression force had been uplifted since that the Blood Emperor Seal had been snatched away by Yishuan. And hence, the essence and blood had broken out at once. Yishuan shouted and stretched out his big hand to grasp. A golden big hand emitted abundant of golden rays of light in the clouds as it extended in the sky. And, those boundless essence and energy were immediately grabbed by Yishuan's big hand. Yishuan felt that the resentful souls lingering in these essence and blood were eating at his golden divinities. The divinities represented the most positive force between the heaven and earth. It was the most noble and mystical power in the world. But, those resentful souls were the most negative force. So, these two opposite forces began to boil and roll inside Yishuan's palm. Yishuan knew that his entire divinities would be consumed if it continued like this. And, he would have the same fate as those people who had been eaten alive a moment ago. Yishuan, you will die. Ha 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 ha. You are presumptuous if you think you will be able to control these essence and blood. Even I had no choice but to take help of the Blood Emperor Seal to keep them in check. How else could you have defeated me so easily? The blood-red-clothed young master laughed wildly and said. He had nothing to be afraid of right now. So, he fearlessly provoked Yishuan. Only a miracle could help him with escaping in the situation he was current in. So, he had nothing to be afraid of. Shut up. Yishuan chained him up inside the space, and isolated his consciousness so that he couldn't see anything outside. Yishuan considered for a moment. There was only one solution, and that was to refine these scarlet energies. And there was one such method in the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power Technique. He wasn't going to practice this power technique. However, that didn't mean that he couldn't borrow help from one of its methods. This was the best solution that he could think of at this time. Yi Shiwen took out the Heavenly Source Mirror without any hesitation. He contained these essence and blood, and rushed back to the Yuan school. The majority of the abilities of the Heavenly Source Mirror had withered after Yi Mo had fallen into deep sleep. This was also a disadvantage of having a tool spirit. Yi Shiwen could have obtained complete control over the Heavenly Source Mirror if there wasn't any tool spirit inside it. However, he didn't have any regrets because he might not have come so far if he had erased Yi Mo's spiritual knowledge back then. He had hurriedly transferred them inside a segregated microcosm after he returned to the Yuan school. This microcosm had been dedicated for his closed-door training. And he began the closed-door training after he had planted the matrix formation and protective barriers. Yi Shiwen cleared his thoughts as he sat cross-legged under the enlightening mind ancient tree. And the entirety of those distracting thoughts suddenly vanished from his mind. Not a single distracting thought could affect his mind anymore, and this kept his consciousness pure and clear. The effectiveness of enlightening mind ancient tree was truly extraordinary. Yi Shiwen felt that his mind had become empty. In fact, the enlightening mind ancient tree had also helped him a lot when he had comprehended the Big Bang Stardust Fist. The biggest advantage of the enlightening mind ancient tree was that it could help an expert to enter a state similar to the moment of enlightenment. Everyone wanted to attain such a mental state. However, they couldn't achieve it. However, one could achieve such mental state with the help of the enlightening mind ancient tree. The mysterious space was quite incredible. However, it couldn't provide Yi Shiwen a true moment of enlightenment. It could certainly boost his comprehension of a technique to 100%. However, it could never boost his comprehension to more than 100% and couldn't give him any new insights. This was the limitation of the mysterious space. However, the enlightening mind ancient tree could help him in attaining that moment of enlightenment kind of state. And this could allow him to have new insights. In fact, it would make him capable of sensing even the subtlest of changes. Yi Shiwen had contained those huge blood clouds inside the Heavenly Source Mirror, and had started to refine them with every ounce of strength he possessed. Those scarlet energies started to get pulled out like threads from a cocoon as he used the Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique. And they transformed into a group of pure energy after undergoing the transformation inside the Heavenly Source Mirror. They were then absorbed by him. This was also the reason why he had dared to attempt this. The Heavenly Source Mirror was capable of absorbing different kinds of energies, and could then refine and transform them. The refined quantity wouldn't be much. However, the essence would be far more pure, and completely harmless. So, there would be no worries in the future. The cultivation pace of Dark Spirit Blood Emperor Power technique was very fast. However, the problem was that there could be many dangers in the future. One's body could most likely explode, and they could die because of forcibly swallowing so much energy for cultivating it to the peak. The more one would cultivate it, the more dangerous it could be. Therefore, one must possess a myriad of methods to suppress these rogue energies. For example, that Blood Emperor seal wasn't only a divine tool. It was also one of the methods to suppress these possible dangers because those boiling energies were required to be contained within one's body. The blood-red-clothed young master had finally lost to Yi Shiwen because he couldn't utilize the Blood Emperor seal to its full potential. And this was the thing which he was most resentful about at this time. Yi Shiwen didn't dare to relax since he was in a situation where he could suffer a setback at any time. In fact, he was wholeheartedly submerged into his practice. Therefore, the energies were being gradually transformed and absorbed by him. Everything was fine in the beginning. And Yi Shiwen was transforming and absorbing the energies without any major trouble. However, he had no choice but to increase his refining speed since more and more resentful souls had gradually begun to eat his divinities. Otherwise, those resentful souls would have eaten him alive even before he could transform and absorb the scarlet energies. Therefore, he had no choice but to gradually increase the conversion speed. Yishuan's body had suddenly turned dark red since his body was full of essence and blood which were being converted into pure energy. It wasn't clear how many people had been slaughtered by the blood-red-clothed young master. He only felt that this power was nearly inexhaustible, and he couldn't absorb it in its entirety. He was left with no other choice. He could only use this immense power to sprint over to the next level. His only option was to strike the threshold of the late stage of the semi-sage realm in order to consume such enormous power. The observing person scripture was operating inside Yishuan's body. His entire body transformed into the void of universe. And he was sitting in the middle of this universe. He was the only god of this universe. Enormous scarlet waves were frantically swirling inside the void of the universe. It was like the mighty ocean waves that crash against the shore. He was already surrounded by endless scarlet waves. And those scarlet waves were unceasingly striking against his body. It seemed as if they wanted to drown him. Yishuan would absorb a part of those waves every time they'd strike his body. And then, he would transform them into his own power. He looked like a mountain that had remained motionless since millions of years. He let these scarlet waves hit his body, and then he transformed them into his own energy. Yishuan's power continued to increase little by little. And these scarlet waves also gradually decreased in volume. Bang! It wasn't clear how much time had passed. However, Yishuan's power had reached a peak point. He took a deep breath, and concentrated his entire power to break the barrier of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Bang! Yishuan impacted the barrier, but failed. However, his countenance didn't show any change. Rather, he continued to attack the barrier. He commanded his observing person scripture to emit the real elemental energy so that he could unceasingly attack the barrier to corrode it. Failed. Failed yet again. Once again failed. Yishuan didn't know how many times he had tried by now. He himself had gradually become numb. However, he had gradually become accustomed to it. His strength would advance by leaps and bounds if he made this breakthrough. However, making a breakthrough was 100 times more difficult for him as compared to an ordinary man, or perhaps 1,000 times. That was the reason why he'd always go out on adventures. He'd always apply a myriad of methods to make breakthroughs. An ordinary person's cultivation might have never advanced if they had come across such difficulties and barriers like Yishuan. He attacked again and again. He'd attacked countless times in each attempt. He had become habituated to such delays while making a breakthrough long ago. So, he was in no hurry. Crack. Yishuan heard the cracking sound deep in his heart. So, he habitually attacked the barrier of the late stage of the semi-sage realm once again. But, he didn't fail this time. On the contrary, he broke the barrier of the late stage of the semi-sage realm in one attack. Yishuan's aura finally had no obstacles. So, it unceasingly burst out of his body, and surged across. Yishuan heaved a sigh of relief. He had finally made the breakthrough into the late stage of the semi-sage realm. His fighting strength had also climbed up once again. And, it had now reached the peak of the intermediate stage of the sage realm. He was now sure that he could contend against the weaker experts of the late stage of the sage realm. Moreover, his current strength was enough to sweep away the experts of the intermediate stage of the sage realm. This was an astonishing change for him. However, another problem had arrived in front of him once he had made the breakthrough into the late stage of the semi-sage realm. And, that was, how would he make the breakthrough into the sage realm? His fighting strength had made the breakthrough into the sage realm. But, his actual cultivation hadn't made the breakthrough into the sage realm. In fact, his fighting strength had already made the breakthrough into the sage realm long ago. However, this had also brought a huge trouble for him. His fighting strength was making the breakthroughs at a very fast speed. But, his cultivation realm couldn't keep up with that speed. And this had made the thresholds even stronger and more firm for him. Hence, making a breakthrough had become countless times more difficult for him than an ordinary person. Therefore, he couldn't liberalize his fighting strength to grow uncontrollably. Perhaps, he might not be able to cross a mountain like the Sage Realm in his entire life if he didn't control his fighting strength and it grew too far away from his reach. It was very difficult for him to make the breakthrough into the Sage Realm even at this stage. In fact, it was far more difficult for him than it was for an ordinary person. Those enormous scarlet energies couldn't help him to enter the Sage Realm. However, Yishuan recalled many pill-making methods at this time. In fact, Yemo had once comprehended many pill-making methods. He had learned to concoct a myriad of medicinal pills. And, they had ranged from low-quality ones to the high-quality ones. Yemo's previous master, the mighty Devil Lord, had once traveled through many worlds unhindered, and had killed countless alchemy masters who used to refine medicinal pills. Consequently, he had obtained methods for a variety of pills. One of those medicinal pills could help a person to make the breakthrough into the Sage Realm. Moreover, there were different kinds of such pills. Yishuan quickly picked one of those pills, Break Sage Yellow Pill. Yishuan knew many such pill-making methods. However, he didn't wish to walk on the path of alchemy. Moreover, it was simply impossible to walk on this road by merely depending upon his unorthodox methods. One must know that the research and refinement behind each alchemy method required the support of huge volume of resources and medicinal ingredients. In fact, almost every renowned alchemy master of the past had been supported by some big force. However, he had no choice at this time. He needed to take this road since he felt that it was difficult to make the breakthrough into the Sage Realm. Chapter 489 Chapter 489 Cuts Off That Dog's Claw. Yishuan realized that 1 year had passed after he came out from the secret territory of the Yuan school. Qi Fifan had already returned to the true martial university, and had submerged himself into cultivation after they had helped Yuan school in wiping out the Qi state's forces. The Yuan school was the only big force in the 10 countries of Southeast region at the moment. They couldn't deal with Qi coalition in the beginning. However, they had now defeated the Qi coalition, and had even annihilated several sage experts. Yuan school was still busy in fixing those huge internal damages. None the 5 big forces of the Great Yu state thought that they could dominate the whole land in the beginning. Even the people of the Yuan school found that they lacked the strength whenever they got the real opportunity. In fact, it was still a bit insufficient even if they put out the entirety of their resources. They had chosen a descendant of the royal clan of the Yu state to step onto the throne. Yuan school didn't care about the worldly matters as long as they were the most dominant martial art force in this territory and were free to cultivate in seclusion. Moreover, Yuan school didn't go on an expedition in the rest of Southeast region. Nor did they swallow the entire territory by taking advantage of the prolonged dispute with the Great Wu state. This was very unlike of what everyone had thought. The majority of the strong forces had been uprooted in the clash between the Qi coalition and Yishuan's team. And, the Great Wu state didn't have any power left to resist as a result. So, the Yuan school had already expanded up to its limit when it came to expansion in the new territory. They would have also met the same fate as the Qi coalition had if they were to try and overstep their bounds. However, the Yu state had still managed to annex the Wu state despite the fact that each country had sustained huge casualties. Consequently, they had leapt up, and had become the biggest force among the now 9 countries of the Southeast region. Yishuan also didn't stay any longer after he saw that the Great Yu state and Yuan school had already cleared the mess, and had begun the post-war reconstruction. He returned to the true martial university, and began to collect the raw materials for the Break Sage Yellow Pill, after he bid farewell to everyone in Yuan school. Yishuan's current cultivation had become twice as strong as before. In fact, he had returned to the true martial university from the Yuan school in just half an hour upon his rainbow light. His speed would have been even higher if he had used his devil wings. Yishuan wasn't anxious. He had unceasingly organized his principles on his way back. He possessed 1200 Tao principles, and each of them was terribly profound. In addition, his aura looked mysterious. His realm had gotten stuck in the late stage of the semi-sage realm. And it couldn't advance quickly. Therefore, he wasn't in a situation where he could continue to increase his principles. He could only deepen the understanding of these principles. His strength was enough to sweep away the powerful experts of the intermediate stage of the sage realm and some weak experts of the late stage of the sage realm. He could do things which others at his level couldn't. Yi Shiwen, the best way for you to make the breakthrough into the sage realm is by using alchemy to refine pills. The power of the medicinal pills can help you in crossing this threshold. Yi Mo's voice suddenly reverberated in Yi Shiwen's mind. His voice was still feeble. However, it had become much better than before. Yi Shiwen nodded. He and Yi Mo had thought about this solution separately. He didn't care whether his foundation was unstable or not. His foundation was incredibly profound. The difficulty he'd face in making the breakthroughs every time had also made his accumulation 1,000 times more profound than that of an ordinary person's. Other people couldn't be compared with him in this aspect. So, he could digest any medicinal pill without any danger. How much have you recovered by now? Yi Shiwen asked. I've recovered a bit after swallowing the Blood Emperor seal. However, it's still just a drop in the bucket. Yi Mo shook his head. He forced a smile and said, it mainly depends upon you now. The quicker your strength would promote, the quicker I will recover. It's 100 times more difficult for you to make a breakthrough than an ordinary person as per your current foundation. However, your fighting strength will advance and reach the peak of the sage realm once you make the breakthrough. It may even surpass the late stage of the sage realm. However, the biggest problem for you is that you must be careful of the schemes. Those rival sects must be targeting you. They will frequently plot against you, by hook or by crook. Fortunately, you are in the domain of the True Martial University in the southern region. The True Martial University can look after you and protect you here. However, you may be chased down by countless forces once you venture out. Yi Mo said. I will be careful. However, how will I see the rainbow if I don't face the winds and rain? The small plants inside the greenhouse can't grow taller and stronger than a big tree in the wild. My present experiences are nothing in comparison to that ancient phoenix world. Yi Shiwen looked firm as he replied. He would often think about that humiliation when he had seen those people take Hua Menghan away. A rage had ignited in his heart. Don't take the unfair advantage of my young age. Everything would reverse once I grow older and more powerful. Just wait and see. Sigh, you. Yi Mo sighed. You still differed by far if that ancient phoenix world is your target. Yi Mo's voice again disappeared after he was done talking. He had again landed into deep slumber. Yi Shiwen didn't think much, and entered the True Martial University treading on the rainbow light. However, he was surprised to see that the True Martial University was in celebration mood at this time. He didn't know what kind of happy occasion this was. However, he wasn't interested in knowing that either. So, he directly went to the Merit Palace Hall to receive his reward. The opportunity to cultivate in the Water Moon Fairyland wasn't the only reward he had gotten for winning this time's martial arts competition. He had also obtained a reward in addition to this. And, this reward was his personal floating peak. He had received this reward so that he could set up his personal abode for cultivation. Only some true disciples of the Great Sage Realm used to enjoy such treatment, along with a few core disciples of the Sage Realm about whom the university was very optimistic. Even some other people who had provided great services used to get such treatments. And, Yi Shiwen had undoubtedly done both. He had killed many other Forces Heaven's Pride experts in this martial arts competition. The True Martial University hadn't said it openly. However, it was a great service towards them in reality. Plus, his performance was extraordinary. Therefore, such reward for him was only natural. He had gone to the Water Moon Fairyland on the very next day of his victory in the championship. And, he had gone to the Yi Yuan school after he had come out of there. Therefore, he hadn't gotten a chance to collect his reward. So, it was the time to receive the reward now. These floating peak abodes were basically microcosms. Even the experts beyond the level of great sage couldn't spot someone if they were to practice inside such microcosms. It was said that each of these floating peaks had been personally crafted by the experts beyond great sage realm. So, these peaks possessed endless prowess. It was appropriate for a highly secretive person like Yi Shiwen. What? My peak isn't here. Yi Shiwen looked at the disciple at the front desk of the Merit Palace Hall with glaring eyes. Yes, senior brother Yi. The front desk disciple forced a smile as he saw Yi Shiwen. He was merely at the legendary's great complete realm. He hadn't even entered the semi-sage realm. How he could withstand Yi Shiwen's imposing aura? Yi Shiwen had intentionally controlled his aura. However, even a tiny bit of it was enormous for this disciple. The Supreme Lord himself has rewarded me this peak. It can't possibly disappear like that. This joke isn't funny. Yi Shiwen restrained that tiny bit of imposing aura that was leaking out. He also knew that there must be some problem since this front desk disciple couldn't dare to defraud him. Well, senior brother Yi. The Merit Palace Hall's disciple somewhat hesitantly looked at Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen had joined the university after him, but he had become a senior expert now. However, he didn't have any complaints or hesitation in calling him senior brother. This world was such that powerful people were respected by others. In fact, the real reason is that senior brother Mu Xingjia has returned. The front desk disciple carefully looked around. It seemed as if he wanted to make sure that nobody was eavesdropping. He was quite careful. Yi Shiwen searched his own memory. And, he immediately remembered Mu Xingjie. This man used to be extremely popular in the True Martial University. He was a senior disciple of the Law Enforcement Hall back then. He had boasted great influence in the Law Enforcement Hall. He was second only to the Great Lord and the elders of the Law Enforcement Hall. However, it was long time ago. It was said that he had taken a group of disciples to a remnant abode on True Martial University's expedition 100 years ago. The reason why Yi Shiwen remembered this man was because Mu Xingjia and big brother Huang Wuji were sworn enemies. Both exceptional talents had arrived in the True Martial University at the same time. Thereafter, they had come into the limelight in the True Martial University. All other Heaven's Pride experts looked inferior to these two peak talents. However, both of them had soon become the most problematic individuals from Pride in the eyes of the True Martial University. Both of them were peak talents. However, they were also sworn enemies. In fact, they had a lifelong enmity between them. They would frequently oppose each other with equal bitterness. However, Huang Wuji had been sent into exile for several hundred years later. This was because he had killed a senior great sage expert of the Law Enforcement Hall. And, the True Martial University had become peaceful ever since. Yi Shiwen clearly knew that Huang Wuji was ferocious. Therefore, he was impressed by this person who had frequently opposed the big brother with equal ferocity. What does his return have to do with me? Yi Shiwen asked. What could be the relation between Mu Xingjie's return and him not getting the peak? It seems that senior brother Yi has recently returned from outside. That's probably why he still doesn't know. Senior brother Mu had led a lot of disciples on an expedition to a remnant abode 100 years ago. And, he has brought that place and that abode under our True Martial University's control now. The experts of the other forces have been wiped out. So, he has done a great service for the True Martial University, the front desk disciple explained. An expression of reverence appeared on his face. Senior brother Mu has deliberately rewarded these disciples who had accompanied him on the expedition for their accomplishments. Many senior sage experts have been rewarded with floating peak abodes. And, senior brother Mu has personally asked for, and taken your peak. What? He has gone too far. Yi Shiwen stared at him with his glaring eyes. He didn't give a rat's ass about Mu Sheng, from where he had returned, and whether he had done any great service or not. However, he had taken away the peak which belonged to him. This was clearly aimed at him. He couldn't believe that nobody would have warned Muxing Jie when he was taking the peak, and informed him that this peak had been set aside for Yi Shiwen by the Supreme Lord. However, he had still taken it away. What did this show? This clearly showed that Muxing Jie was targeting him. True Martial University's floating peaks were precious. However, they were present in large quantities. There were many peaks that didn't have any owners. However, he had still taken away his peak. Wasn't this obvious? Good, he has done it now. Yi Shiwen laughed instead of being extremely angry. Senior brother Yi, you can choose another floating peak. The Supreme Lord has told me to give you any floating peak of your choice, the front desk disciple said. There's no need. They don't belong to me. So, I don't want them. However, I will cut off the claw of the dog who dares to touch my stuff. Yi Shiwen coldly replied. Chapter 490. It was the Metropolis single peak as that disciple had mentioned. In fact, there was no need to get too tangled with this matter. However, the opposite party had targeted him. And, Yi Shiwen couldn't swallow this thing. Do you know whose hands the Metropolis single peak has fallen into? Yi Shiwen asked. I've heard that it has fallen into the hands of Do Hexing. He is a disciple of the previous session. He was quite famous among the disciples of the previous session. He later went on an expedition to those ruins along with senior brother Muxing Jie. And, he has returned now. I've also heard that he has already entered the Sage Realm. He has been rewarded with Metropolis single peak, that disciple answered. That disciple looked at Yi Shiwen. Sage expert wasn't as exaggerated an existence for that disciple, unlike the people of the 10 countries of Southeast region. However, a sage expert was hard to match nonetheless. However, this man who stood before his eyes wasn't a pushover either. So, it wasn't good to make him angry either. In fact, one inappropriate sentence, and he might attack. Yi Shiwen didn't have a small number of murders to his name either. The law enforcement hall was too flamboyant. It was an independent force that was big enough to rival the influence of the Merit Palace Hall. However, they were bound to face a fierce retaliation from him if they were to provoke him. There were only a handful of people in Hidden Star Peak, but all of them were rebellious and downright crazy. Even their leading disciple Huang Wuji had once been provoked like this, and the so-called might of the law enforcement hall had groveled before his wrath. I will go and see who has dared to lay hands on my stuff. Yi Shiwen sneered. He took large strides, and trod out of the Merit Palace Hall. He then transformed into a streamer of light and disappeared. There was a jubilant atmosphere on a floating peak located in the depths of the true Martial University. Metropolis single peak was engraved on a huge stele at the foot of the mountain. There was a palace situated atop the floating peak. A group of disciples who were clad in different clothes were sitting in wooden chairs in a circle. And, an approximately 25 or 26-year-old man was sitting on the main chair. His facial features looked rough and wild. He possessed a wild aura. The killing intention that he had honed during the expedition hadn't completely vanished yet. Many congratulations to senior brother Do on moving into your new home, a disciple took the initiative and cupped his hands in obeisance as he said. Other disciples also followed suit, and cupped their hands in obeisance as they congratulated him. That man with rough and wild facial features was Do Hexing. His faintly looming principles and aura were leaking out of his body every now and then. Do Hexing let out a tiny smile in the face of everyone's praise. However, he was very happy inwardly. People hadn't been very optimistic about him in the beginning. Then, he had left for the ruins along with Muxing Jie. And, he had obtained enough in return after his arrival at this time. The efforts he had made over the last 100 years hadn't gone in vain. I would also like to congratulate senior brother Do for attaining such a huge achievement, and moving a step forward to the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. An individual from other side congratulated him once again. The faces of the other people exposed a slightly envious look. Their cultivations had been at the same level as his in the beginning. However, they were still swaying in the initial stage of the Sage Realm at this time. In fact, some of them were still at the semi-sage realm. However, the other party had already entered the intermediate stage of the sage realm. So, it was evident that his cultivation must have been toned very well. It's nothing. Do Hexing waved his hand. He tried to pretend that he didn't care about this thing. However, the smile at the corner of his mouth showed how complacent he was with his achievement. However, I've heard that this abode belongs to some other disciple. Someone raised this topic. I know. I've heard that he's the champion of this time's martial arts competition that had taken place between the four major forces, someone who had heard about Yishuan added. These powerhouses of the sage experts didn't care about the new disciples. What was the value of a new Heaven's Pride expert for them? A new disciple may have become a Heaven's Pride expert, but the said individual was still a new disciple, nothing more. They didn't need to be wary of a new disciple. They could easily dominate the new disciples whenever they wanted to. He is also a Heaven's Pride level expert, someone raised his eyebrow and said. They couldn't do anything regarding a Heaven's Pride of the same generation. However, they didn't worry much about these younger generation's Heaven's Pride experts. He might grow up to an astonishing condition in the future. However, that wouldn't happen anytime soon. So, there was nothing to be afraid of. Humph. He has merely won the martial arts competition, and he was rewarded with a floating peak. It's very unfair. We had gone on True Martial University's expedition. So, we should be the ones to get such a reward. What are those newbies in front of us? They are merely like flowers in a greenhouse. Do Hexing raised his eyebrows as he said in extreme anger. This was unfair in his opinion. He had been on True Martial University's expedition for 100 years. So, he deserved such rewards. What did that Yishuan do? He had merely won the martial arts competition, and had obtained such rewards in return. He believed that those high-level old fogies had gone blind. That semi-sage disciple who had revealed Yi Zaiwen's identity looked at Do Hexing. He didn't know what to say. Yishuan hadn't merely won an ordinary martial arts competition. Furthermore, he had also slaughtered many peak Heaven's Pride experts of the rival forces. The result of such contribution might not be visible in a short time. However, everyone would come to know after a long time had passed. He had effectively eliminated many senior great sage experts of the future. Many of his victims may have become great sage-level enemies, but he had made them disappear without any trace. So, this reward wasn't excessive if one were to consider it in this light. However, he didn't say anything out loud since he was faced with the unanimous waves that were crusading against Yishuan. Moreover, he too was quite envious of Yishuan. You are right. These new disciples don't deserve floating peaks. Those higher-ups are doing a favor on them. I've heard that several other Heaven's Pride experts have been rewarded with their personal floating peak abodes, a sage disciple spoke up in a bitter tone. How long ago he had entered the sage realm. However, he still couldn't dare to think about having his own floating peak. Then, how could he bear to see these young talents getting theirs at such a young age? The new disciples are supposed to maintain low-key profile, and cultivate with care. We aren't allowed to deal with them. Otherwise, we could easily crush them to death, another unsatisfied disciple added. Humph. Humph. They haven't acted insolently yet. Do Hexing sneered and replied. However, I've heard that Yishuan is quite insolent. He gives no respect to our law enforcement hall. One disciple had clearly heard about Yi Zaiwen's previous accomplishments, especially the matter that he had killed the disciples of the law enforcement hall right after he had entered the True Martial University. What did he do? Do Hexing frowned and asked. All of them were the disciples of the law enforcement hall. So, they were obviously the most sensitive with regard to matters when someone looked down upon their law enforcement hall. I've heard that he has killed many lower-ranked disciples of our law enforcement hall. Many cultivators of the younger generation that had been nurtured by our law enforcement hall have also died at his hands, that disciple replied. Audacious. Do Hexing banged his fist on the table and shouted ferociously. It seems that we have been gone for far too long. Many people have forgotten our law enforcement hall's prestige. One must be killed on the spot if they've dared to oppose our law enforcement. But, he is still alive even though he has killed our law enforcement hall's people. Are you people pigs? The faces of those disciples turned dark red as they were scolded. However, they couldn't say anything in reply. They had secretly started to hate Yishuan even more. Would they have been scolded if it weren't for Yishuan? Which inheritance does he belong to? I can't believe that this bastard has dared to disrespect our law enforcement hall, and he's still being shielded by someone. Do Hexing's piercing gaze swept across them. The murderous aura that he had nurtured throughout his expedition of 100 years had soon diffused in the surroundings. That Yishuan is a disciple of the Hidden Star Peak. We had put pressure on every major inheritance, and had asked them to ignore his application to join them. All of them were afraid to offend us for one mere disciple. However, the people of the Hidden Star Peak offered him shelter. Moreover, they have also opposed us many times. We thought that he's just an ordinary disciple. We didn't expect that he could grow to this extent. It's that Hidden Star Peak again. Do Hexing frowned and said. It wasn't that they hadn't been able to deal with the people of the Hidden Star Peak this time alone, it had been this way since the start of that conflict between Huang Wuji and Mu Xingjie. It should be mentioned that the law enforcement hall couldn't deal with many people. After all, many people weren't fond of law enforcement hall's overbearing methods. The Hidden Star Peak didn't have many people. However, the Hidden Star Peak was considered as an eyesore by the law enforcement hall because of Huang Wuji. Why not attack as soon as possible since we know that he's tough and it's difficult to deal with him? These cruel and untamed guys are the unstable elements that contaminate the university. So, it will be good for the university if we eradicate such people. Do Hexing suggested. He had forgotten that the disciples of the law enforcement hall couldn't be outdone when it came to being overbearing and unstable. Many high-level old fools are very optimistic about him. In fact, the old lord of Xian City has specially told our hall's lord to warn us against resorting to extreme methods against him, one disciple replied. These old fools are taking unfair advantage of their positions. They are incompetent fools. Wait for senior brother Mu to occupy the top position of the lord. We will sort such people out once that happens. Do Hexing clenched his fist and said. The other people weren't surprised either. The disciples of the law enforcement hall would often become the law enforcement's great lord. The great lord of the law enforcement hall was considered a big shot in the true martial university. In fact, the lord of the law enforcement hall stood side by side the supreme lord and the other big players in the university. In fact, even the supreme lord couldn't ignore the suggestions of the law enforcement hall's great lord. And, Mu Xingjie had almost been accepted as the next lord of the law enforcement hall. Many other elites were also cultivating in the law enforcement hall. And, many of them were classified as important cultivators as well. However, those people couldn't be compared with Mu Xingjie. In fact, most of them had been trained under Mu Xingjie. So, he hardly had any decent opponent. Therefore, it was already final that Mu Xingjie would be the next great lord of the law enforcement hall. But, Mu Xingjie wasn't satisfied with the position of the law enforcement's great lord. He was eyeing at the position of the supreme lord. Not a single disciple of the law enforcement hall had ever acquired the top position in the university. After all, one must think about the concerns of other powerful organizations as well. Who would check and balance the growth of the law enforcement hall if a person of the law enforcement hall itself had reached at the top position? Therefore, the people having backgrounds in these authorities were often not selected for the top position. However, he didn't care. Nobody could stop him if he wanted to do something. In fact, he could create history since nobody had accomplished it before. This idea had enormously affected these disciples since they were under his control. Do Hexing's voice had barely faded when a loud shout suddenly sounded from outside, "Get out!" Chapter 491. Get out! A loud shout came from outside. Who is daring to act so audaciously here? Everyone in the group looked at each other in shock. They hadn't expected that someone could arrive here and provoke them. Who are you? Do you have a death wish? How dare you intrude into our law enforcement hall's territory and provoke us? Everyone cursed in quick succession. This was akin to a tight slap on their faces. Who are you? Do Hexing asked the person who stood outside the metropolis single peak. He saw a young man who was approximately 20 years old. He was clad in black clothes. His complexion looked indifferent. He was standing firmly in midair. Yi Shiwen. Someone in this group recognized Yi Shiwen. Many of these retinues didn't approve of Yi Shiwen deep down in their hearts. However, his reputation had skyrocketed after the Four Forces martial arts competition. You're Yi Shiwen. Do Hexing coldly looked at this man who stood before his eyes, and asked with some interest. You're Do Hexing. Yi Shiwen opened his mouth and asked. He frowned and said, don't you know that this is my abode? I know. Do Hexing laughed mischievously. Then, his facial expression turned sinister and started to look very ugly. But Do Hexing raised his head, and shot a glance at Yi Shiwen. He then said, it's mine now. We won't move out of here. This is our law enforcement hall's area now. Let's attack him right now. Let's take the advantage of this opportunity and annihilate this insolent guy. Let's put him down. Several people shouted from behind Do Hexing. Many of them already considered Yi Shiwen to be an eyesore. Yi Ziwen's existence had enormously decreased the law enforcement hall's prestige and status. Moreover, many of their law enforcement hall's disciples had also sustained injuries because of him. So, they obviously weren't happy with Yi Shiwen. This man is someone who hesitates to do something until he's forced. He has even dared to come here by himself in order to kill all of us. I think those old guys won't have anything to say in this matter. Our law enforcement hall must restore its prestige since Senior Brother Mu has returned, a disciple maliciously spoke up. Yi Shiwen had killed several disciples of the law enforcement hall. However, he was still alive and kicking since the law enforcement hall hadn't been able to catch him. This was obviously a big humiliation for them. Even their leftover prestige had vanished. It wouldn't make up for this insult if they had gotten hold of this man who had killed their disciples, and had offended their organization to such extent. The law enforcement hall was responsible for maintaining the laws of the true martial university. Therefore, the loss of their prestige was deadly for them. I was looking for an opportunity to teach you a lesson. However, I must slaughter you since you've offended my people. And, I will restore the prestige of our law enforcement hall by doing this. Do Hexing roared loudly. He hadn't been present in the true martial university for 100 years. However, he had already formed a bad impression of Yi Shiwen from whatever he had heard about him thus far. How dare a trivial semi-sage expert be arrogant before me? Do Hexing suddenly attacked. He stretched out his hands, and grabbed the spirit energies from the surroundings. Those spirit energies were absorbed by his hands, and got transformed into a pair of big hands. Those big hands then swept down towards Yi Shiwen. It was a secret martial arts technique. It looked quite simple. However, it was an extremely exquisite martial arts technique. The entire space had been distorted under the hold of his hands. Is this the legendary technique Control Crane 7 Divine Hands? This secret martial technique is a supreme technique which was created by some almighty force if one is to believe the legends. One can grab the mountains and rivers, and split them within their grasp if they are able to practice this technique to the peak. However, hasn't Senior Brother Mu obtained it? Senior Brother Mu had found this secret technique when he had made a narrow escape from the ruins. How has Senior Brother Do learnt it? I know about this. It has been said that Senior Brother Mu has taught him a part of this technique because he had accomplished a great deed for him. He only knows a portion of this technique. However, it still possesses endless might. Senior Brother Do has become one of the strongest experts of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm even though he has entered the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm very recently. And, that's all thanks to this set of martial arts. Control Crane's 7 divine hands. A mysterious light flashed in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. He and Mu Xingjie would certainly have to fight one day. So, he wouldn't be caught off guard at that time if he would get to see this technique now, since this martial arts had been taught to this man by Mu Xingjie himself. Yi Xuan felt that an incomparably powerful fluctuating power had emerged out of Do Hexing's body after he had used the Control Crane's 7 divine hands technique. His terrifying vitality surged up, and the dreadful strength of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm manifested. Yi Xuan was wary in his heart. He must kill him on the spot, and mustn't give him any opportunity to fight back. Otherwise, he might not be able to deal with the enemy's deep strength even if he were to use the full extent of his semi-sage powers. He had cultivated his strength over the 100 years he wasn't in the true martial university. So, Yi Xuan obviously didn't know his real fighting strength. Therefore, the only possibility would be to give up and get killed if Yi Xuan allowed him to unleash the true extent of his powers. Ha! Yi Xuan shouted, and stretched out his hand. It transformed into a fire-colored cloud as it took the form of a big hand. It seemed as if his big hand would shake the heavens and break down the earth as it swept down from the sky. The fire cloud's falling sky hand would reach the level of perfection when used by Yi Xuan. Consequently, this attack made the entire horizon collapse, and left it to split open. Only red tracks were left in the vast sky. Rumble. 3 big hands collided in the sky. Yi Zaiwen's fire cloud's falling sky hand routed the offensive of the Control Crane's 7 divine hands at a lightning speed. In fact, the opponent's move collapsed at the very first encounter. Therefore, the clash didn't continue for too long. This had left everyone dumbstruck. How could the legendary Control Crane's 7 divine hands be so weak? How is this possible? You're just a semi-sage realm expert, nothing more. How can you be a match for me? Do Hexing couldn't believe this. It was simply unbelievable. Other people didn't know that he hadn't showed any leniency. In fact, he had gone all out. He had revealed the entire extent of his powers in order to kill Yi Xuan. However, he hadn't thought that he still wouldn't be able to kill Yi Xuan. On the contrary, his own offensive had been routed. What kind of technique is this? How it can be so ferocious? Do Hexing couldn't believe that Yi Xuan had more strength than him. He was only a semi-sage expert. How he could contend against an expert of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm? The only possible explanation was that it had happened because of the technique he had used. This is the fire cloud's falling sky hand. Someone on the other side recognized this technique. He knew that this was Fire Cloud's falling sky hand. This is Fire Cloud Cave's technique. You're a spy of the Fire Cloud Cave. It seemed as if Do Hexing had suddenly grabbed an opportunity to prove his point. You've dared to collaborate with the people of Fire Cloud Cave. You're courting death. Ha ha. You will die this time. Nobody can save you. Idiot. Can only the people of the Fire Cloud Cave have the Fire Cloud's falling sky hand? Yi Xuan sneered in reply. It's impossible. Even the Fire Cloud's falling sky hand can't defeat the Control Crane's 7 divine hands in this way. Someone still couldn't believe this. Senior Brother Mu had once crushed the body of a top heavens pride expert of the Fire Cloud Cave, and had extinguished his soul with the help of the Control Crane's 7 divine hands. It doesn't matter whether the technique is ferocious or not. Everything depends on the man who uses it. Yi Xuan sneered. There were many techniques which didn't have any difference in their intensities. In fact, most of them were almost at the same level. It didn't matter whether it was ferocious or not. The most important factor was the person who was using them. There have been plenty of examples of this in the history. For example, Qiao Feng had used long-range punch and kicking style named Long Fist martial art to defeat countless heroes. Yi Xuan was at such a state that he would be more powerful than Do Hexing even if his strength were to drop to its 1/10. However, that should have been an impossible scenario. After all, Yi Zaiwen's cultivation was only at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. But, His fighting strength was enough to sweep away the experts of the intermediate stage of the sage realm. In fact, he could even contend against some of the weak experts of the late stage of the sage realm. This is impossible. Do Hexing couldn't believe this. The control crane's 7 divine hands swept down towards Yishuan once again. I don't understand what you're so optimistic about. Bang! Yishuan unleashed a backhand blow. And, the fire cloud's falling sky hand attacked once again. The fire-colored big hand ripped apart Do Hexing's control crane's 7 divine hands, and struck him on his body. Poof! Do Hexing felt that a heavy force had suddenly banged upon his body. In fact, this slap had broken down his defenses, and had smashed against his body in a split second. He felt a strange taste in his mouth, and suddenly spouted mouthful of blood. Crunch crunch. It wasn't clear how many of his bones had been broken. In fact, it seemed as if the entirety of the bones in his body had been crushed by Yishuan. Bang! His body crashed onto the ground on the metropolis' single peak like a meteor. And, a huge pit the size of his body had been formed in the ground as a result. He couldn't even move. Moreover, he soon came to realize that his cultivation had been destroyed. Slim-looking man. This was more severe than a death penalty. Death ends the entirety of one's troubles. He had lingered around life or death several times in his expedition of 100 years. So, death wasn't a big deal for him. However, he had now been tossed into a situation where he hadn't died, but hadn't been left to live either. He had become a cripple since his martial arts cultivation had been destroyed. And, this feeling had left him so depressed that he wanted to die. How can this man be so ferocious? Senior Brother Do had followed Senior Brother Mu in the expedition to those ruins for many years. He possessed such high cultivation. However, he couldn't even resist one move from this guy. Isn't he just a new disciple of this session? How he can be so outrageously powerful, someone who couldn't believe this exclaimed. He has dared to destroy Senior Brother Do's martial arts cultivation. This man is extremely fierce. He is like an exceptionally ominous devil. Someone was left dumbstruck since he had witnessed that Yishuan had destroyed Do Hexing's martial arts cultivation. They had obviously heard Yizaiwen's fierce name in the past. They had also heard that he had never had any trouble winning. However, Yishuan had earned a fierce reputation among the younger generation. So, the seniors didn't care too much about that. They believed that the younger generation's disciples would need too much time to reach to their level. In fact, they felt that even the Heaven's Pride experts of the younger generation would need several decades for that. So, they obviously hadn't expected that Yishuan would surpass their strength so quickly. They had obviously heard rumors about him. But, they had believed them to be mere rumors, nothing more. So, they wouldn't have been shocked to such an extent if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. The time duration for which the law enforcement had been regulating the true martial university's punishment laws was unclear. They had already established supreme prestige among the ordinary disciples in the past. In fact, one would have to face a situation even worse than death if they dared to violate their rules, or offended them. However, Yishuan hadn't met an untimely death even though he had dared to attack the law enforcement hall head-on. On the contrary, he had ultimately risen above the others, and had become an extraordinary persona. Yishuan grinned and revealed his white teeth. He was unaware how Mu Xingjie had come to know about him. However, he wasn't the type of person who'd just sit and wait for death when the opposite party had already made a move. Chapter 492. Yishuan wasn't the kind of person who would sit idle and wait for death. Nobody could make him resign to the fate. He hadn't been afraid of anyone since the time he had entered the true martial university. Bullying the weak and fearing the strong was the common issue that everyone faced. The people of the law enforcement hall wanted to implicate him for restoring their prestige. It wasn't that he hadn't warned some of these people. He had warned some of these people to not mess with him. However, he didn't expect that he would end up attracting the attention of a figure like Mu Xingjie. One must know that Yishuan just looked promising enough to enter the great sage realm in many people's opinion. However, Mu Xingjie had already entered the Great Sage realm. And, only the real Great Sage experts had the authority to speak up in the true martial university. But, this authority wasn't extended to those who had merely been labeled as geniuses by other people. In fact, this tag was pretty much worthless before the real deal. It wasn't clear how many geniuses were present in this world, perhaps 100 million would be a good estimate. It couldn't be said that they looked like a group of ants gathered at one place. However, it was almost the same in reality. Geniuses of different ages and levels had gathered at one place. However, not even 1% of them could reach to the top. Large number of such geniuses used to arrive in the true martial university in every 100 years. Geniuses and so on, were most valuable. However, they were also the most worthless at the same time. Yi Shiwen, how dare you? Dou Hexing roared and glared at Yi Shiwen. However, he looked weak as he said this since he didn't have the strength to stand up again. His entire martial arts cultivation had been destroyed. What should I not dare? Don't forget that you are standing in my abode. And, I remember, according to the regulations of the university. I won't be held responsible even if I kill you since you have arrived here in secrecy and without taking the permission of the real owner of this peak. Yi Shiwen grinned and revealed his white teeth. They were shining very radiantly in the sunlight. However, the courage of the disciples of the law enforcement hall had vanished as they heard Yi Ziwen's words. This splendid smile was similar to that of a devil's in their opinion. An expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm like Dou Hexing looked like a paper toy in front of him. In fact, he had fallen apart with just one poke. He was no match for Yi Shiwen. They recalled one such rule. However, it was them who had initially recalled this rule in order to find an excuse to kill Yi Shiwen. The metropolis single peak was Dou Hexing's domain in their opinion. So, they had a great opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen here. And, those old fogies wouldn't be able to say anything even if they wanted to. However, they didn't expect that the situation would reverse. Those who had believed themselves to be predators in the beginning had become their prey at this time. And, they were shivering in front of Yi Shiwen since they weren't a match for him. No, this is my abode. It seemed as if Dou Hexing didn't wish to give up. He had become a crippled person since his martial arts cultivation had been destroyed. So, he might not be able to catch up with his past achievements even if he would get the opportunity to restore his cultivation in the future. Even the safety of his life would be in danger in the future. It wasn't known how many people he had offended in the past. And, he would now be even worse than rats for those old enemies without his martial arts cultivation if he were to face them again. So, they could easily crush him to death. Your abode. I don't know how this place has become your abode. Yi Shiwen sneered and said, you yourself can go and verify that this is my, Yi Ziwen's, abode. The Supreme Lord himself has especially rewarded me this abode. This abode was expropriated by Senior Brother Mu. And, he has given it to us as a reward. Dou Hexing was burning with rage as he looked at Yi Shiwen. However, it was no longer a killer gaze as it used to be. Mu Xingjie. What does he think of himself? Does he consider himself as true martial university's supreme lord? Yi Shiwen laughed disdainfully. When did he gain the authority to have the final say? And, you thought it's really yours because he said it's yours? He had thought about this point carefully. And, this was where he was making sense in this matter. After all, the Supreme Lord had rewarded him this peak. And, this man took it over because Mu Xingjie had said that he could have it. How this could be such a simple matter? You. Dou Hexing became angry. Mu Xingjie was like a god to him. However, he was no better than dog shit in Yi Ziwen's opinion. So, Yi Ziwen's logical argument had touched a sore spot. He previously didn't care about Yi Shiwen. However, it wasn't because he considered that Mu Xingjie was superior to the Supreme Lord. He believed that Mu Xingjie must have his reasons since he had done so. Moreover, he believed that Mu Xingjie could take care of high-level matter as long as he could deal with Yi Shiwen when he would come back, and that's the end. However, he underestimated Yi Shiwen. After all, Yishuan had arrived only 10 years ago. And he himself had arrived 100 years ago. So, there wasn't supposed to be any problem even if Yishuan was this session's top Heaven's Pride expert. Therefore, he allowed Yishuan to speak so long as he could defeat Yishuan. Verbal attacks are powerless anyway. However, he hadn't thought that Yishuan would be so terrifying that an expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm like him would appear like a paper toy in front of him, and would be defeated by him so quickly. He was the kind of person who was most proud of his own strength. However, he stood no chance in front of Yishuan. This thing had hurt him the most. More and more disciples had gathered in the surroundings by now. The fight between Yishuan and Do Hexing had extracted massive amounts of spirit energies from the surrounding area of over 50 kilometers radius. And this had alarmed many sage-level disciples who were undergoing closed-door training. An ordinary fight couldn't alarm these top-notch disciples of the true martial university. However, the sage-level fight between Yishuan and Do Hexing had alarmed them. In fact, many powerful existences had also swept out their divine senses from the depths of the true martial university. This place was located in the depths of the true martial university. And many powerful existences were present in the depths at this time. So, they swept out their divine sense in quick succession to check. Isn't he Yishuan? How this can be possible? Isn't that Do Hexing, who has recently arrived? How has he been beaten to such an extent that his martial arts cultivation has been destroyed? Has this Yishuan actually done it just now? It's impossible. Do Hexing is a disciple of the previous session. And, what is this Yishuan? He is only a new disciple of this session. There is a difference of at least 100 years between them. However, this situation looks so. Leave the past. Yishuan is the so-called Heaven's Pride expert. You think yourself. You yourself used to be a Heaven's Pride expert when you had arrived in that session back then. You are well aware that ordinary reasoning doesn't apply on the Heaven's Pride experts. However, why are they fighting each other? And Yishuan has even resorted to such extreme methods. Isn't he afraid that he will be punished by the high-level experts? I think I know the reason. Yishuan has won this time's martial arts competition among the four forces. He was supposedly rewarded with a floating peak abode. And this peak before our eyes must be that one. However, Mu Xingjie snatched it later. So, I reckon that this must be the reason behind this conflict. Again, it's Hidden Star Peak and Law Enforcement Hall. Can't they stay together? It seems that the senior disciples of the Hidden Star Peak and Law Enforcement Hall don't have friendly relations. What's strange in this? The Law Enforcement Hall regulates the punishment laws of our true martial university. However, their way of working is very high-handed and overbearing. Don't all of us dislike them? The Hidden Star Peak doesn't have too many disciples. However, all of them are incredible. Whether it's Huang Wuji or Yishuan, each of them is cruel and untamed. How they will obey the Law Enforcement Hall. And this has resulted in a hostile situation between them. Yishuan coldly looked at Do Hexing. He didn't launch another attack on him because they were in the true martial university. Otherwise, this man would have died at his hands by now. He then entered the metropolis Single Peak. This would be his abode in the future. This would be his lair. However, Yishuan hadn't traveled too far inside the metropolis Single Peak when a rumbling sound suddenly reverberated, and it seemed as if he had triggered some matrix formation. Countless spirit energies present in the surroundings gathered up as a result. And they condensed at the center of the matrix formation and took a humanoid form. It turned out to be the form of a man. However, it wasn't clearly visible. A dreadful pressure emerged out of this man's body, and swept towards Yishuan to subjugate him. In fact, it seemed as if it would crush him in the very next moment. Yishuan looked in the direction of that man. However, he could only see that man's ice-cold and ruthless eyes. He looked towards Yishuan and said, "You're Yishuan? Good, you're very courageous. You dared to barge into the abode of a core disciple. Do you know what kind of offense this is? Offense. How would I know that returning to one's own home is an offense? Yi Shiwen sneered. His eyes had turned ice cold. He was staring back at that man who had a fuzzy appearance. I have given this peak to a disciple of our true martial university as a reward for doing great deeds for the university. And you have just won a martial arts competition. You don't deserve an abode. That man looked at Yi Shiwen and frowned as he spoke. Yi Shiwen finally guessed the identity of this man. His appearance wasn't clearly visible. However, he must be that Mu Xingjie. He possessed an incomparably formidable strength. And he must have laid down this matrix formation for the so-called future safety. Mu Xingjie, do you think that you're the Supreme Lord? Do you believe that whatever you say will become the law? You decided to give it to someone, and so it will happen? Yi Shiwen frowned. This Mu Xingjie was far more overbearing than what he had imagined. In fact, he was entirely different from a proud and aloof person like Huang Wuji. Both had risen to fame because of their own strength. However, their personas were entirely different. Huang Wuji was proud and aloof. He would often keep distance from the outsiders. However, he didn't dislike anyone. However, this Mu Xingjie was overbearing. Even the spectators disliked him. That's right. Whatever I say becomes the law. My word is the law in the true martial university. Yi Shiwen, you have committed many mistakes. You've killed the disciples of my law enforcement hall. I wasn't present at that time. However, I have caught you red-handed now. Mu Xingjie spoke up in a matter-of-fact manner. And he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. You must surrender now. I know you are quite talented. So, I can let you go if you hand over your treasures and destroy your own martial arts cultivation. This is the only way for you to survive. Good, good, good. It's a brilliant idea. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth in anger and replied. This thing would be even worse than death. You don't know how to appreciate a favor. Mu Xingjie shouted. And a big hand suddenly swept towards Yi Shiwen to grab him. Chapter 493, Chapter 493, Chapter 493, Slaughtered. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Mu Xingjie stretched out his hand to grab Yi Shiwen. The land under Yi Shiwen's feet began to disintegrate under the terrifying pressure. In fact, cracks had begun to appear in the ground. It looked exceptionally terrifying. This was the same Control Crane's 7 divine hands. However, it looked completely different in Mu Xingjie's hand as compared to what Do Hexing had displayed. In fact, these were two entirely different kinds of feelings. Even the disparity between them was very big. It didn't seem as if the unleashed power was from the same technique. In fact, there was a big disparity in every aspect. And it was simply beyond imagination. However, this didn't happen because there was disparity in the essence of the power technique. Do Hexing had practiced only a portion of this power technique. However, it couldn't be compared with Mu Xingjie's complete version of this power technique. And this disparity had basically occurred because of the difference in the martial power of both individuals. Only a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul had incarnated here. Yes, that's right. Yi Shiwen had realized at a glance that it wasn't Mu Xingjie's actual body, but only a wisp of his soul. However, it was far more powerful than that Do Hexing even if it was only a wisp of his soul. The dreadful strength of Mu Xingjie's real body was hard to imagine. Yi Shiwen's hands suddenly emitted golden lights. They then transformed into falling sky hand, and swept out to grab. He was merely facing a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul. However, he still didn't dare to underestimate him, and used his entire strength from the get-go. Bang! The two big hands collided in the sky. The space collapsed along with the mutual annihilation of the two hands. Both of them seemed to be evenly matched. Mu Xingjie saw that Yi Shiwen was able to resist his attack. You don't know how to appreciate favors. I had decided to give you a way out. However, I didn't expect that you would be so arrogant. I will have to protect the sovereignty of my true martial university's legislation now. And, I will have to execute you on the spot. Mu Xingjie coldly said. Do you consider yourself a god that whatever you say will become a law? Yi Xuan laughed in a taunting manner. This is only a wisp of your soul, nothing more. I wouldn't have surrendered even if your entire figure were to be present here, let alone such an insignificant wisp of soul. Then, you must die. Whoever dares to challenge the law enforcement hall's people must die. You aren't an exception either. Mu Xingjie sneered. He again attacked Yi Xuan. His body emitted even brighter rays of light than before. And, it obscured half of the sky in a split second. A big hand suddenly swept out from these endless rays of light. And, the entire sky began to disintegrate as the big hand swept out. Yi Xuan repeatedly shot his fire clouds falling sky hand, and weaved a huge fiery red net in the sky. Consequently, the incoming attacks were blocked even before they could reach him. This is the fire clouds falling sky hand. It belongs to the southern barbarian people of the Fire Cloud Cave. This secret technique is known only to the people of the Fire Cloud Cave. You are a spy of the Fire Cloud Cave. You must be killed this instant. I'm sure that those old fogies will have nothing to say in this case. Mu Xingjie sneered. He had finally gotten hold of Yi Xuan's weak point. What a joke! Can only a spy of the Fire Cloud Cave obtain Fire Cloud's falling sky hand? I can see that you have also learnt this Control Crane 7 divine hands from an unknown source. So, you must be a spy of some other sect as well. Yi Xuan replied. He could also use such scheme. However, he still felt that it was beneath his dignity to use such dirty tricks. You have a razor-sharp mouth. It's not surprising that you fooled those old-timers. However, it's useless in front of me. You must die today. The killing intention had become even stronger in Mu Xingjie's eyes. Yi Xuan had practiced the fire clouds falling sky hand to such an extent that it was enough to guess how talented he was. He didn't believe that Yi Xuan was a spy. However, he needed an excuse. The more outstanding Yi Xuan's performance was, the stronger his killing intention would become. And, it had soon reached an extent where it seemed like he would kill Yi Xuan. Mu Xingjie didn't wish to talk nonsense with Yi Xuan any further. The Control Crane 7 divine hands technique was simple. However, it was mixed with a special core cultivation method. And, it unleashed such might in Mu Xingjie's hand that it could destroy the heaven and extinguish the earth. It seemed as if the sky would be annihilated every time he attacked. His mediocre-looking moves contained endless murderous aura. Every move was a manifestation of the extremity and truth of the main Tao principle. Yi Xuan wasn't going to be outdone either. The Control Crane 7 divine hands was exceptional. However, he had also practiced the fire clouds falling hand to perfection. This technique was once founded by the barbarian god. And, it had regained its glorious might in Yi Xuan's hand. So, his attacks weren't yielding to those of Mu Xingjie's. Yi Xuan, you're not fast enough. Mu Xingjie shouted while facing Yi Xuan's attack. You won't get a chance to run away once my real body appears. Real body. Ha ha ha. Your real body will appear. Say that again when it appears. Yi Xuan burst into laughter as he replied. He was certain that Mu Xingjie's real body couldn't move into action. Otherwise, he would be accused for bullying the weak. Perhaps, Yi Xuan wouldn't be taking it so lightly if Mu Xingjie had threatened him earlier. However, the situation was different now. Yi Xuan had displayed enough talent. Perhaps, this fight had already alarmed the high-level experts. So, it would be strange if his real body were to move into action now. Good, very good. It seemed as if one could see the real Mu Xingjie gnashing his teeth in extreme anger. It was clearly visible that he was extremely angry. Many spectators gasped in amazement since they hadn't thought that they would see such a scene. Mu Xingjie is very angry right now. He has attacked personally. However, he still can't get hold of a new disciple like Yi Shiwen. Yeah. It's merely a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul, but its strength is enough to sweep away the experts of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. However, it looks useless in front of Yi Shiwen. It doesn't have any way to get a complete hold of him. Yeah, even a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul should be extremely dreadful considering his strength. Moreover, he has returned from the ancient ruins, and has obtained enormous benefits. He's undergoing closed-door training at present. He must have thought that only a wisp of his soul would be enough to handle this matter. However, it now seems that he was overconfident. That Yi Shiwen is the genuinely dreadful person. That is Mu Xingjie's soul we are talking about. It has to be extremely dreadful even if it's a wisp of his soul. We can't dare to say that we can prevail over his soul. However, Yi Shiwen is facing it head-on. Moreover, he hasn't fallen into a disadvantageous situation yet. He is extremely dreadful. I don't know how Yi Shiwen has learnt the fire cloud's falling sky hand. But, he has learned it to such a profound level that even the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave will be surprised if he sees this. These two individuals are undisciplined and out of control, especially Mu Xingjie. Even the elders of the Great Sage Realm don't dare to interfere into his matters. He holds the control power of the law enforcement hall in his hands. How can some ordinary elder be a match for him? Mu Xingjie looked at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold eyes. He was standing firmly in the dome of heaven. He was looking like a god. And, he was staring at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold and ruthless eyes. His murderous aura seemed boundless. You have talent. So, I had offered you a chance to redeem your crime as long as your martial arts cultivation was destroyed. However, you won't be able to make up for your crime even if you die 100 times now. Mu Xingjie solemnly spoke up. You talk too much. Yi Shiwen suddenly trod forward at an incredible pace. His entire body transformed into golden light, and he disappeared without any trace. Then, he appeared right in front of Mu Xingjie the very next moment. Yi Shiwen hadn't used his entire power. In fact, he had retained some of his power, just in case. However, his current power was already very dreadful. His gilded tyrant form was particularly intrepid. The power technique of this sect had laid down the foundation of his body. A fist attack with full concentration could reverse the flow of a river. Yi Shiwen didn't feel the need to use his entire strength while facing an expert like Mu Xingjie. He might say that he was quite relaxed. However, he was incomparably afraid in his heart. He didn't dare to relax even if only a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul had condensed up. However, Yi Shiwen was also confident that only a wisp of that man's soul had reincarnated. So, it would definitely sustain serious injuries even if didn't die once it came under his fist. Mu Xingjie was still calm and composed. He suddenly used the Control Crane 7 Divine Hand, and a big hand swept towards Yi Shiwen to catch him. It transformed into an offensive that covered the entire sky. Yi Shiwen also made the counterattack. Yi Shiwen was well experienced. It wasn't clear how many times he had made a narrow escape. However, Mu Xingjie didn't have less fighting experience than Yi Shiwen. So, they had almost immediately found out each other's limits. An iron sword appeared in Yi Shiwen's hand in a split second. And, an astonishing sword intention surged up. Yi Shiwen used the Buried Heaven Sword. And, it suddenly cut open the Control Crane 7 Divine Hands, and went towards Mu Xingjie to chop him. Mu Xingjie promptly retreated in order to avoid Yi Shiwen's iron sword attack. Yi Shiwen had learnt a myriad of martial arts techniques. And, he had already reached perfection in planning the next move in advance. Therefore, no matter whether it was the fire cloud's falling sky hand or the buried sword's secret, they displayed enormous might in his hand. Moreover, he had grasped all of them with his fingertips. So, he could use them effortlessly. How is it possible? Yi Shiwen has forced Mu Xingjie to retreat. In fact, he has almost been cornered by Yi Shiwen. Am I making a mistake, Or are my eyes not working properly? Someone couldn't believe as they saw this scene and exclaimed. All of them were Sage Realm disciples as well. However, they were still left dumbstruck as they saw this scene. And, they started to doubt their interpretation of this scene after they watched it unfold. Nobody has ever caused so much trouble for me. Yi Shiwen, you are the first person to do so. Mu Xingjie had been forced to retreat by Yi Shiwen. However, his face was still exposing a cruel expression. It seemed as if being forced into the disadvantageous situation by Yi Shiwen was ordinary for him. However, Yi Shiwen also knew that this was only a wisp of his soul, nothing more. So, he didn't care about it much. He may manage to prevail over Mu Xingjie, but he would only do so over a wisp of his soul. It was nothing. In fact, it might not even have 1/1000th the strength of his real body. Shouldn't I feel proud? Yi Shiwen laughed out loud at first. He then said, you must die. One sword had forced Mu Xingjie to retreat 100 steps. However, Mu Xingjie still couldn't find a foothold. He was surprised to find that the surroundings had already sunk into a universe. Moreover, an enormous star had already pounded upon him along with Yi Shiwen's fist. Rumble. Yi Shiwen shot his big bang stardust fist, and it crushed Mu Xingjie. Bang! Mu Xingjie's body had been condensed by a wisp of his soul. How could it resist Yi Shiwen's sudden bombardments? It suddenly transformed into endless spirit energies. Chapter 494. Yi Shiwen crushed Mu Xingjie's body that had been formed from a wisp of his soul. He then grabbed that wisp of his soul in his hand. Yi Shiwen, you mustn't feel too pleased with yourself. You will die when my real body comes out of the closed-door training. Mu Xingjie's voice was still ice-cold. Whom do you want to kill? What do you think you are? Yi Shiwen disdainfully laughed. Mu Xingjie was very violent, cruel, and untamed. In fact, he had reached an extent where it was quite difficult to describe him. He considered everyone beneath him, or it could be said that he had too much confidence in himself. He had dared to overrule the Supreme Lord's decision. It was merely a small matter. However, it was evident that Mu Xingjie was arrogant and despotic. This was also the reason why the high-level experts used to tolerate him. Yi Shiwen also enjoyed high-level experts' tolerance like he did since the high-level experts attached great importance to these geniuses. A genius had always been placed above 1,000 mediocre individuals since the beginning. Any sect must look at the performances of these geniuses in order to flourish over time. The mediocre people were useless to them. This was the reason why the high-level experts didn't say anything on this fight between these two individuals. Otherwise, any other person in their place would have been arrested by the people of the law enforcement hall by now. You can be pleased with yourself for now. But, you will die when the next competition between the Sage Realm disciples takes place. Mu Xingjie spoke up in his usual ice-cold voice. You talk too much. Yi Shiwen crushed that wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul, and it dissipated. It was merely a wisp of his soul. However, it contained a lot of information, including some secrets of the Control Crane's 7 divine hands. Yi Shiwen brought his mysterious space into play, and began to analyze the secrets of this Control Crane's 7 divine hands. Meanwhile, his hands slowly started to perform some styles of the Control Crane's 7 divine hands. The more and more adept he became in this new technique, the cleaner his movements started to become. Many spectators felt that they had seen a ghost when they saw this scene. In fact, they were even more shocked as compared to when Mu Xingjie was defeated. After all, only a wisp of Mu Xingjie's soul had been present here. However, Yi Shiwen had quickly learnt the Control Crane's 7 divine hands, and had adopted its movements. This was far beyond their imagination. Such an exaggeration shouldn't have been possible even if he possessed a very sharp memory. They were unaware that Yi Shiwen could grasp the essence of any technique as long as he had enough spirit energies and an accurate method of cultivation. However, Yi Shiwen had learnt too many secret techniques by now. So, he only learned a little bit of this technique. And he stopped after he had learned some of the key strength and weak points of this technique. He had done this since a conflict might break out between him and Muxing Jia in the future. It was said that this control crane's 7 divine hands was Muxing Jia's special skill. Therefore, Yishuan needed to examine it to some extent. This was the so-called know thyself and your enemy in order to win every fight. However, Yishuan didn't relax after he crushed Muxing Jia's soul because Muxing Jia had spoken about the sage disciples competition before he had disappeared. There were many competitions for the disciples of different ranks in the true martial university. And, this time's competition was the biggest official competition among the core disciples. And most importantly, every sage-level disciple of each big force of the entire true martial world would gather in this competition. Moreover, the venue of this competition was located in the devil world. Every big force would join hands to open the passage that would lead to the devil world once the competition would start. And, a large number of sage disciples would go in. The more devils they would kill, the more their scores would increase. And, the one who would obtain the highest score would become the champion. This was also true martial world's method of opposing and controlling devil world's invasion. They used to organize such competitions at regular intervals so that a large group of experts could venture into the devil world and cause wanton destruction there. This would consequently delay devil race's next invasion of the true martial world. The conflagration of war would spread inside the devil world, and would burn it from within. It was useless to enter the devil world if one possessed weak strength. They would get killed rather quickly. However, the devil world might quickly find out if great sage experts entered in such big numbers. And, the true martial university's people might have to face the siege of countless devil experts in that case. The great sage experts would also take part in such competitions. However, their numbers wouldn't be so large. One would become elite among elites if they could manage to endure the conflagration of war of the devil world and come out of it alive. Yishuan could only contend against some weak experts of the late stage of the sage realm at the most as per his current strength. However, he must think to rise above others at that place. In fact, survival wasn't guaranteed inside the devil world even if one were to be an expert of the late stage of the sage realm. The disciples of the law enforcement hall could be found everywhere in the entire true martial university. In fact, many experts among the sage-level disciples belonged to the law enforcement hall. And, many such experts would be directed against Yishuan in this time's competition since Muxing Jia had said so. However, there were still 10 years left for the competition to start. So, he had the time to improve himself. He must at least have the power to defend himself. Yishuan went inside the palace of the metropolis Single Peak after he had tossed these matters out of his mind. The control of this floating peak abode was in his hands now. Those spectators were left dumbstruck as they saw Yi Zaiwen's figure gradually disappear before their eyes, especially those people who were aware about the ins and outs of this entire matter. They couldn't help but be stunned by these two undisciplined and untamed guys. It was well known that Muxing Jia considered everyone beneath him. He didn't even care about the Supreme Lord's reputation. The Supreme Lord had set this floating peak aside for Yishuan. However, he had still dared to say that he would take it away, and he did exactly so. It wasn't a big matter for the Supreme Lord. However, Muxing Jia's arrogance could be seen from this action. However, Yi Zaiwen's incomparable tyranny wasn't any less in comparison to Muxing Jia's arrogance. Most people wouldn't dare to oppose Muxing Jia after they'd hear about his glorious past. In fact, most great sage-level elders didn't dare to interfere in his matters. So, it was evident that his fierce name had flourished everywhere. However, Yishuan had still arrived here and challenged him. He had disregarded what Muxing Jia's soul had said, and he had even destroyed that wisp of his soul. He didn't even seem afraid of the consequences. Yishuan was undoubtedly an undisciplined and untamed man. Some old fogies had been observing this from the mystical depths of the true martial university in secrecy, and they couldn't help but recall the past image of Huang Wuji's. It seemed to them that Yishuan was an undisciplined and untamed individual. Huang Wuji couldn't endure any injustice either. But, He had been outside for a long time, and hadn't caused much trouble as a result. However, he had made earth-shaking ruckus when he had returned the last time. He had even rushed to the war-dead Star Peak, and had chased their leader until he had nowhere to run to. He wasn't some law-abiding citizen. And many people saw Yi Shiwen, and felt that he looked similar to Huang Wuji of the past. The news that Yi Shiwen had defeated Mu Xingjie's soul had spread quickly throughout the entire True Martial University. And the entire university had begun to bustle with noise because of this. Both involved individuals were a kind of person whom nobody would dare to approach. Yi Shiwen had recently won the martial arts competition that had taken place between the four forces. So, it could be said that his incredible strength had come into the limelight. Moreover, he had also gained the attention of the high-level experts, and everyone had reckoned that he would most likely become a senior great sage expert in the future. However, Mu Xingjie was an even more outstanding character. He had become famous in the entire True Martial University many years ago. And most importantly, he had just returned after establishing great service for the university. So, he had also gained praises from many high-level experts. Yi Shiwen had returned a very short while ago. So, his strength was yet to come into the limelight again after the collision between these two men. It should be mentioned that no one had expected that he would dare to go out and look for trouble. This conflict between Yi Shiwen and Mu Xingjie had once again instigated the conflict between the Hidden Star Peak and the Law Enforcement Hall. It had now become the keenest struggle ever. Many people still had the memories of it. It seemed as if this conflict had begun a long time ago. The Hidden Star Peak and the Law Enforcement Hall had never had friendly relations. And two top Heaven's Pride experts like Huang Wuji and Mu Xingjie had amplified the memory of this conflict in the minds of people. However, Yi Ziwen's arrival had again highlighted the conflict between the two forces that had begun to quiet down a bit of late. There were two basic points of conflict in this matter. The Law Enforcement Hall wanted to manage everything. First, they had a habit of poking their nose in everything. Secondly, they wanted everything under their control. However, everyone in the Hidden Star Peak disliked and criticized their habit of poking their nose. And this was the triggering factor that had laid down the foundation of this conflict. Everyone was watching. An even bigger conflict might break out between both sides in the future. And both sides might go all out against each other. Everyone knew that the Law Enforcement Hall was a powerful institution. In fact, only a few institutions in the entire True Martial University were at par with them. Moreover, they had a huge number of experts. However, the Hidden Star Peak only had a few people. But each of them was ferocious. There were 7 individuals altogether. And 4 of them were powerful Great Sage level senior experts. The remaining 3 were the senior experts of the Sage realm. This strength might not rank them among the top 10 inheritances. However, it was enough to rank them at the forefront of the top 100 inheritances. Huang Wuji had single-handedly made a huge ruckus in the entire War-Dead Star Peak. So, people didn't dare to look down upon the Hidden Star Peak because of Huang Wuji's strength. In addition, Yi Ziwen's outstanding performance in the Four Forces martial arts competition had also made everyone aware of the fact that the Hidden Star Peak couldn't be underestimated even though they had a very few disciples in their ranks. Many people wanted to see the collision between two forces in which one was extremely powerful, and the other had few disciples but was high-handed. Those people who couldn't deal with the Hidden Star Peak, or those who considered the Law Enforcement Hall as an eyesore were particularly keen to see this happen. They hoped for a big fight to break out between the two sides. And they wanted the results to be disastrous. In fact, it would be best if both sides suffered a loss. However, both the sides concerned had strangely maintained silence in this regard. In fact, it seemed as if they hadn't paid any attention to this matter. The outside world was bustling with excitement. However, Yi Shiwen himself felt as if nothing had happened. He went straight to the Merit Palace Hall. Yi Shiwen had barely entered the Merit Palace Hall, but he had already attracted the attention of countless people. His popularity had increased enormously since he had been a part of so many matters. He didn't hide his cultivation this time. He had messed with the people of the law enforcement hall, and had still dared to come out and run all over the places. Such courage couldn't be regarded as small. Yi Shiwen didn't pay attention to the astonished gazes of the people who were present in the surroundings. And, he approached the disciple who was present at the front desk of the Merit Palace Hall. He then said, "Help me in finding out the medicinal ingredients that have been mentioned in this list. Which ones among these can be redeemed with the points I have accumulated? And, which ones do I need to purchase?" The materials required for the Break Sage Yellow Pill were listed in this list of items. However, he had also made sure that the people of the True Martial University couldn't get through the materials which were mentioned in his list of items and guess which immortality pill he wanted to refine. In fact, he had listed many insignificant and unnecessary drug ingredients for safety. Moreover, some drug ingredients with completely opposite effects were also mentioned in this list. So, it would be deadly if someone were to get hold of this list of items and attempted to refine the pill. Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen heard a faint shout in his ears. Chapter 495. Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen heard a faint shout. The sound of footsteps came from the gate of the Merit Palace Hall along with a cold shout. It was a man of approximately 27 or 28 years of age. He was clad in a white robe. His physique appeared tall and slim. It seemed as if his face had been carved with a knife. His handsome face was as cold as frost. He strode in and ran his eyes over the place, and eventually shot a glance at Yi Shiwen. Yi Ziwen's entire body tightened up. He could feel that this man's aura contained the ferocity of a wild beast. And, it also carried a faint murderous aura. It seemed as if he had experienced too many battles, same as Do Hexing, since it was seemingly difficult for him to conceal his killing intention. "Who's this man? He has such a great murderous aura," someone asked. "Don't you know him?" "Ah. He has been out of the big limelight these days. He's a great disciple of the Law Enforcement Hall. Mu Xingjia is very proud of this subordinate of his. He's Chao Yuyu. It's said that his strength has already reached the perfection level of the Sage Realm. He is about to enter the half-step Great Sage Realm. He's a rare young talent who has emerged out in the recent years." "Yeah. I've also heard about him. He had gone on that expedition with Mu Xingjia for 100 years. He has an illustrious fame to his name. He's quite famous in the True Martial University. All the young core disciples of the Law Enforcement Hall follow his commands. Mu Xingjia attaches a lot of importance to him. But, why he has arrived here? Is he going to start a fight with Yi Shiwen?" someone asked in a doubtful manner. It would appear as bullying if he were to attack Yi Shiwen at this time. After all, he had cultivated for so many years. And, Yi Shiwen had practiced for many years lesser. So, he would be breaking the rules if he were to attack Yi Shiwen regardless of his status. And, this act of bullying would provoke Huang Wuji and the Hidden Star Peak. Then, they would have no scope for excuses. Unless, there was a valid reason. A fight between two individuals of the same generation was passable by the Law Enforcement Hall even if it was based on some arbitrary reason. "Are you Yi Shiwen?" Chao Yuyu looked at Yi Shiwen. His ice-cold vision didn't have the slightest of fluctuations. It seemed as if he was looking at a dead person. "You're quite audacious. I've seen many daring people whose attempts to provoke our Law Enforcement Hall's prestige have gone in vain. And, all of them are dead now. I've also seen many people who wanted to crush me in order to establish their prestige. All of them wanted to kill me, but they are also dead now." Yi Shiwen grinned and revealed his white teeth. His face exposed a slightly genial smile. However, his words didn't show the slightest sign of weakness. A fierce light flashed in Chao Yuyu's eyes as he heard these words. He didn't conceal his killing intention and swept it out towards Yi Shiwen. However, he was surprised to see that Yi Shiwen didn't budge. In fact, he remained motionless. Moreover, Yi Shiwen didn't seem the least bit suppressed. Many people who were present in the surroundings could feel this killing intention, and had goosebumps because of it. In fact, they had retreated several steps in order to avoid the rage of this killing intention. However, it seemed as if Yishuan wasn't feeling anything. He looked unaffected in his entirety. And, this had stunned everyone. They now admired Yishuan even more than they used to. No wonder he has dared to mess with the people of the law enforcement hall. He's no weakling who would crumble at the first blow. However, they were unaware that Yishuan was using his divinities to protect his body. So, it could be said that pressure that was put upon him felt no different to him than a burst of cold breeze upon his face. It had no effect on him. After all, God is the most powerful entity in the entire world. The invincible might of gods was like a prison. No suppression or imposing aura was going to work in the face of God's power. In fact, any attempts would be a joke since such influences were worthless before divinities. An astonished look flashed in Chao Yuyu's eyes when he saw that Yishuan wasn't affected, and wasn't in any pain either. He said, "Very good. It's not surprising that you dared to oppose our law enforcement hall. However, you are gravely mistaken if you think that you can get away by depending on your clever little tricks and schemes." Yishuan merely shook his head, and burst into laughter. "What are you laughing at?" Chao Yuyu frowned and shouted. "I'm laughing at you for being too outrageous. It seems that you believe every matter to be a provocation to your prestige." Yishuan replied in a casual manner. "Mu Xingjie has so much importance in your eyes. It seems as if you take him to be some god. However, he's worthless in my opinion. I would have killed him by now if we were to be at the same level. In fact, killing him wouldn't have been any more difficult than killing an ant by trampling it in that case." The crowd went in an uproar. Mu Xingjie had been famous for so many years. His power had shaken the true martial university. He was an extremely illustrious expert in the entire true martial university. He was a super expert who had a promising future, and might even obtain the next Supreme Lord's position in the future. However, he was worthless in Yi Zaiwen's opinion. Words are as light as a feather. However, these words had smashed down like a sudden clap of thunder. Killing Mu Xingjie is like killing an ant. Who could have dared to say such a thing? Could Huang Wuji have dared to say this? He certainly wouldn't have dared to say this. It didn't matter how prideful Huang Wuji was. He wouldn't have spoken these words. He was very proud and aloof. But, saying such words would have been beneath his dignity because one would only feel embarrassment after they had spoken such words. However, Yishuan was different. Many people reacted at this. Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength wasn't bad compared to that of other Heaven's Pride experts. However, his cultivation hadn't been making quick progress since the beginning. He had only reached the late stage of the semi-sage realm so far. In other words, he was merely at the level where other Heaven's Pride experts used to be several years ago. And, this was a few years ago. A few years' time was enough for the fighting strength of the Heaven's Pride experts to make a qualitative breakthrough. However, Yishuan had managed to beat those other Heaven's Pride experts a few years ago. What did this show? This showed that Yishuan had risen above the rank of a Heaven's Pride expert through his unusual cultivation. Countless people were left in shock after they thought along these lines. They hadn't previously thought that this could be the possibility. Perhaps it could be said that many people had been deceived by Yi Zaiwen's fighting strength. So, they hadn't thought this. Yishuan could fight with those Heaven's Pride experts when his realm was lower to that of theirs. So, what would happen when his realm would rise? I would have killed him like an ant if we were to be at the same level. Such words weren't empty in this case. Rather, it was an achievable fact. Everyone's way of looking at Yishuan suddenly saw a drastic change. Chao Yuyu was merely staring at Yishuan with his ice-cold eyes. The killing intention in his eyes had become even stronger. Mu Xingjie was like a god to him. And, Yishuan had used bad words to insult his god. This had made it difficult for him to control his murderous aura. Yishuan didn't care since Chao Yuyu's murderous aura wasn't affecting him in the slightest. So, he obviously didn't pay attention to it. Yishuan knew that Mu Xingjie was determined to kill him. So, there was no room for leniency. Anyway, it wasn't as if Yishuan would have said some pleasant words for the sake of leniency. Yishuan, you should be glad. Senior brother Mu has allowed you to live till the big competition between the Sage Realm disciples. However, that lease on your life is only valid till that time. Chao Yuyu sneered. He suddenly raised his arm, and wrote down a declaration of war in midair. It took the shape of a declaration of war talisman and swept down towards Yishuan. This talisman carried unmatched power as it suddenly pressed down upon Yishuan. It then transformed into a huge steel, and swept down towards Yishuan to suppress him. Yishuan felt that a dreadful pressure had tightly locked onto his body. And, he couldn't budge as a result. Chao Yuyu was also a former Heaven's Pride expert. So, he was far ahead of Yishuan in every aspect. Moreover, the steel had nearly broken the void as it pressed down. Die here if you can't even accept my declaration of war. Yishuan heard Chao Yuyu's cold shout. However, he didn't put much effort in thinking at this time. The golden divinities suddenly crawled over his entire body. And, it started to seem as if he had put on a golden divine cloak. People exclaimed as they saw Yi Zaiwen's peak fighting strength. Chao Yuyu had merely written a war declaration. However, it had forced Yishuan to use his entire strength. Yishuan genuinely lacked in front of him at present. Yishuan was an outstanding genius. However, Chao Yuyu was also a Heaven's Pride expert of his generation. Moreover, he had cultivated for several hundred years more than Yishuan. So, Yishuan was very far behind. In fact, his cultivation hadn't even entered the Sage Realm. But, the opposite party was already at the perfection level of the Sage Realm. Ha! Yishuan shouted loudly. His energy surged up and formed a pillar that soared straight into the sky. He took a step, and his entire body transformed into a universe. He was the only god in this universe. One fist suddenly swept out. It transformed into a huge star, and began to rotate at a very fast speed. It then went up to face that steel. Rumble. The steel and the huge star suddenly collided. The space collapsed and chaos flushed in. It seemed as if the world had turned upside down. The sky began to shake. And, a dreadful power recklessly swept out rotating in the sky. The shocked waves swept across, and destroyed Yi Zaiwen's star. It seemed that this force would sweep away the Merit Palace Hall. However, an overwhelming power unexpectedly appeared when this power had swept out. This newly appeared power crushed this force, and extinguished it. This was Merit Palace Hall's own power. Yi Zaiwen's face was covered with golden divinities, but it had turned very red. The blow from that dreadful force had obviously left his blood and energy to boil and roll over. The stone floor under his feet had transformed into fine powder by now. It had been crushed by that tremendous power. It's only a written declaration of war. There was no need to make it so fancy. Yishuan suppressed his surging vitalities and grinned. The Phoenix regeneration technique began to operate crazily in order to repair his injuries. He hadn't been injured to such an extent since a long time. So, he hadn't needed to use the Phoenix regeneration technique to such an extent in a while. Chao Yuyu genuinely hadn't restrained his strength. It was difficult for Chao Yuyu to conceal that astonished look in his eyes when he saw that Yishuan had suppressed his surging vitalities within the blink of an eye. He knew that he hadn't used his entire strength in this move. However, he had still done it with the idea to suppress Yishuan to death on the spot. In fact, he wouldn't have complained even if he were to be punished as long as he could accomplish that. This kind of attack would have easily suppressed an ordinary sage expert to death. And, an expert at the perfection level of the sage realm would have sustained injuries under such attack. However, Yishuan had withstood that attack. Moreover, he hadn't died. It seems like the rumors that this boy possesses an extremely tyrannical body aren't baseless. Enjoy the remaining few years of your life properly. Chow Yu said this at first. Then, he turned around and left the Merit Palace Hall. Chapter 496. The news that Chow Yu had handed down a declaration of war to Yi Xuan had quickly spread throughout the entire True Martial University. And, it had added fuel to the enmity between the Hidden Star Peak and the Law Enforcement Hall. It wasn't set to happen very soon, but a time span of 10 years was nothing for these experts since they had extremely long lifespans. It should be mentioned that this wasn't a clash between the experts of the same rank. Moreover, many people recalled that Yi Xuan had entered the True Martial University only 10 years ago. And, not much time had passed since he had entered the legendary realm. However, he had already surpassed those Heaven's Pride experts in these 10 years. And, this was an incredibly fast speed. God knows the extent he would grow up to after 10 years. In fact, it was possible that he might even obtain the strength to contend against Chow Yu. Yi Xuan was somewhat depressed in regards to this. However, he didn't say anything. He didn't say that he had agreed to the competition either. However, it seemed as if everyone had already approved of this competition. And, they simply didn't care what Yi Zaiwen's opinion was. Could Yi Xuan refuse in their opinion? Certainly not. After all, Yi Xuan had earned a huge reputation. Wouldn't it be equal to losing face in the True Martial University if he refused at this juncture? Yi Xuan remained silent on this matter. How much money was a thing like reputation was worth? One might lose their life for it, and it would still amount to nothing. The reason why he didn't refuse was that he also felt that no one knew what would happen after 10 years. He obviously didn't know how far he would have cultivated by then. The most important thing was to arrange the materials required for refining the break sage yellow pill. He didn't have much experience regarding this. However, he knew that it was impossible for an alchemy master to collect the materials required for refining the break sage yellow pill without having the support of a big force. The reason wasn't money. Yi Xuan had ample wealth at present. In fact, he had more than enough wealth to refine an immortality pill of this grade. And, this was considering the situation in which his mysterious space and he himself would also be consuming the primary spirit dawn for cultivation. However, there were many real problems. For example, this pill required many herbs which weren't common. In fact, many of them were simply unheard of. Moreover, there was a requirement of many rare and heavenly treasures as well. It was impossible for a random cultivator with no background to obtain these things. Only the treasure house of a big force could possibly have such things. A random cultivator with no background aiming to become a powerful alchemy master was a myth. Even those extremely rare pill-making methods which Yi Xuan knew, were also useless if he didn't have the required materials at hand. He knew that the great alchemy masters who had left behind these incredible alchemy scriptures weren't the high-level experts of some big force. Nor they had established some colossus forces that were spread across countless domains. They had only focused on collecting a myriad of materials in order to ensure that they had the materials required for their alchemic practices. Therefore, the alchemy masters who were random cultivators would perennially be seen wandering in deep mountains and old forests since they'd always be on the lookout for heavenly treasures and herbs. Yi Zaiwen's list of drug ingredients had gradually begun to fill up since he could rely on the backing of a force like the True Martial University. However, he soon realized that his accumulated points had gradually become insufficient. Yi Xuan had been gone for a long time. And, he hadn't gone on many assignments of late as a result. And thus, he hadn't obtained many points of late. In fact, he had only gained points by winning the Four Forces martial arts competition in recent times. However, these points weren't enough for Yi Xuan because his list of items contained many drug ingredients, and all of them were very precious. Moreover, there were some ingredients that weren't regarded as precious, but they were still very rare. Therefore, he needed a bountiful of accumulated points in order to obtain them all. However, the Northern Dipper organization would also send him some tasks every now and then. The Northern Dipper organization was huge. And, it had a broad area of operations. In fact, its area of operation wasn't limited to the true martial world alone. Northern Dipper organization didn't prohibit its members from receiving tasks. One could receive a wide range of tasks as long as they could afford to handle them. The Northern Dipper organization didn't have many people in its ranks. However, each of them was elite. And their sources of information were beyond the imagination of an ordinary person. However, he hadn't gotten any news from the Northern Dipper organization thus far. So, he didn't have any choice but to start earning points after he had obtained more than half of the drug ingredients in the True Martial University. An astonishing amount of materials are required to refine the Break Sage Yellow Pill. However, it wouldn't have been able to help a person in making the breakthrough to the Sage Realm if it didn't require such a huge amount of materials. Yi Shiwen thought. He hadn't heard of a pill in the True Martial University which could help a person in making the breakthrough into the Sage Realm. Sage experts were considered top-notch experts in the True Martial University's main force. Only a few could get an opportunity to surpass the Sage experts. The great Sage experts were like the pillars of the university. And all of them were regarded as chief cultivators of the top 100 inheritances. Those masses of semi-sage experts would have also made the breakthrough into the Sage Realm if such a pill existed. And True Martial University's strength would have consequently seen a qualitative promotion within a short time. I can only go on assignments and earn points. Then, I can get those herbs in exchange. Yi Shiwen thought. He could only think of this method at this time. He could have certainly exchanged the primary spirit dawn for the amount of points that he needed. However, it wasn't a good deal since he didn't have enough primary spirit dawn for himself. So, how could he have exchanged it for the points? The current Yi Shiwen couldn't be compared with the old one who used to frantically take on missions. He used to be a very insignificant legendary expert back then. So, he could only receive a limited number of tasks. However, his realm had reached the late stage of the semi-sage realm now. Moreover, his fighting strength was enough to sweep away the experts of the intermediate stage of the sage realm. It was like the difference between the heaven and the earth. Time passed day by day after Chao Yu had unexpectedly issued that declaration of war against Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen didn't undergo closed-door training, nor did he submerge himself into cultivation as everyone had thought he would. Rather, he had begun to receive tasks in a frantic manner. Many sage disciples were left dumbstruck as they saw the course of these events, and the manner in which those tasks were completed by Yi Shiwen. Everyone was trying to guess what Yi Shiwen was up to. He wasn't cultivating properly. He was only wandering everywhere after having received the tasks. One could train oneself through these tasks. However, the progress speed wouldn't be quick since one wouldn't be cultivating wholeheartedly. However, the news that Yi Shiwen was purchasing great amounts of heavenly treasures and medicinal ingredients got exposure as time passed. And someone guessed that he was collecting materials for some immortality pill. Someone had even asked a great alchemy master in the True Martial University regarding this matter. However, that alchemy master wasn't sure which pill Yi Shiwen wanted to refine. But he was sure about one thing, and that was that Yi Shiwen was collecting materials for some pill. It was reckoned that this pill must be very important. Otherwise, Yi Shiwen wouldn't have kept aside his cultivation to collect these materials. People's opinions differed for a moment. Someone said that this was a kind of pill which could increase his strength. Another person said that this might increase his speed. Then, Yi Shiwen was informed via a report that the medicinal ingredients which he wanted to collect had been sold out. And none were left in stock as a result. How wouldn't he have understood that the people of the Law Enforcement Hall were behind this matter? The people of the Law Enforcement Hall had also found out that these ingredients were very important for him. Therefore, they had cut down the stock. Yi Shiwen and the Law Enforcement Hall's people had grudges. So, they obviously wouldn't provide support if he was in need. Those people of the Law Enforcement Hall are behind this. They have resorted to such a cheap method. Yang Wenjun was enraged by this. He directly pointed a finger at the Law Enforcement Hall. There was no need to inquire about this matter. He knew who was behind this. Yi Xuan was frantically finishing tasks one after another in order to earn the points. So, he had made Deng Shui Xin and Yang Wenjun in charge of collecting these medicinal ingredients. He had handed over his points to them, and he had told them to buy these drug ingredients whenever someone would come to sell them. Yi Xuan had barely returned after having completed a task when he heard Yang Wenjun's complaint. However, he wasn't very surprised. What could the law enforcement hall know do if their overbearing nature was taken into consideration? But, to think that they had resorted to such a cheap method was a bit beyond Yi Ziwen's expectations. Perhaps the name of the break sage yellow pill would have spread everywhere if they knew which pill Yi Xuan wanted to refine. Yi Xuan wouldn't be surprised if they had guessed that he was planning to use some alchemy method, because it wasn't difficult to guess thus. The only thing which was difficult to guess was the name of the pill he wanted to refine. They had obviously gotten a hold of the list of ingredients Yi Xuan wanted to purchase. However, it was merely a list of ingredients. They would be hard-pressed if they would attempt to guess what they were for. Moreover, they would find themselves against an impossible task if they were to try and find the method to refine the said pill. And, they were genuinely underestimating those true ancient grandmasters of alchemy if they felt that it was simple to refine it. In fact, Yi Xuan had been looking forward this. He wanted them to try and refine a pill on the basis of that list of ingredients. The bad luck that ensue would obviously be theirs in the end. They would have to try millions of times for each pill-making method that would fail. And, the law enforcement hall would go bankrupt if they genuinely tried millions of times since these herbs were extremely costly. However, Yi Xuan couldn't do anything in this matter. After all, these medicinal ingredients were in the hands of other people. So, he couldn't stop them from giving it to anyone they so desired. However, the arrival of a new individual completely solved Yi Ziwen's problem. It was Northern Dipper Organization's Wood Dragon of the Horn. He had arrived clad in a moon-white robe. However, he didn't have the weak temperament of Qingzus. In fact, he had a stern and chilly air about him. On the contrary. He was tall. A wine bottle was hanging on his body. And, the strong fragrance of alcohol assailed the nostrils. Yi Xuan was meeting this Wood Dragon of the Horn for the second time. This man was a little too elusive. In fact, it seemed as if the true martial university wasn't fortified enough for him. He had some special ways that helped him pass unseen. However, he could only evade ordinary security, and not the vigilance of genuine experts. "Why have you come here?" Yi Xuan frowned and asked. "I have arrived here for a good reason," the Wood Dragon replied. "You had asked about some drug ingredients from the organization last time. The organization has the information. It had some of those drug ingredients in its stock. And, it has purchased the ones it didn't have at that time." Yi Xuan remembered that he had requested the Northern Dipper Organization to collect these drug ingredients several months ago. However, they hadn't paid much attention to his request at that time. The Northern Dipper was an outstanding organization. However, he had considered them to be an organization which recruited only the disciples of the younger generation. Therefore, he had believed that this organization couldn't be compared with the true martial university. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.